She set 40 plates on that table with trembling hands, and not one man stayed long enough to finish. They pushed back their chairs, dropped their napkins on the floor, and walked out like she was nothing. Eleanor Hayes stood in that empty cookhouse, looking at 40 untouched suppers going cold, and she made herself one quiet promise: she would not cry and she would not leave. She went back to that fire and started again. If a woman who refused to quit speaks to your heart, subscribe to this channel, follow Eleanor's story all the way to the end, and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1886 came to the Montana Territory like a fist hard dry and without mercy. By the time Eleanor Hayes stepped off the supply wagon at the edge of Morgan Mountain Ranch, the sun had already burned the morning sky into a pale, colorless white. She carried one small canvas bag over her left shoulder and an old recipe book pressed flat against her chest with her right arm, like she was shielding it from something. Her boots were worn at the heels. Her dress was clean, but faded at the sleeves. She was 27 years old, and she had lost nearly everything she'd ever tried to build. The wagon driver didn't offer to help her down. He just slowed the horses enough that jumping wouldn't break her ankle, and when her feet hit the dirt, he clicked his tongue and drove on without a word. Eleanor stood there a moment in the rising dust and looked at the place that was supposed to be her new start. Morgan Mountain Ranch sprawled across the base of a steep rocky slope, hemmed in on three sides by pine-covered ridgelines that went up so high they disappeared into the haze. The main house was a two-story timber structure with a covered porch running the full length of the front. The cookhouse sat maybe 40 yards to the left, a long, low building with a rusted stovepipe poking up from the flat roof. Beyond that, a bunkhouse, a barn, 3 corrals, and a scattering of lean-to shelters that looked like they'd been added in a hurry and never finished. The whole place had the look of a man who'd been too busy surviving to bother making anything pretty. There were cowboys everywhere. Men moving between the barn and the corrals hauling water-mending fence-line working horses in the near pasture. 25 of them on the payroll she'd been told by the agency in Billings. 25 ranch hands on a remote mountain cattle operation, and they hadn't had a cook in 3 weeks. The first man who noticed her stopped walking entirely. He was maybe 40 broad through the chest with a sun-cracked face and a hat that had been through too many seasons. He stared at her the way a person stares at something that doesn't fit the picture they were expecting. Then he elbowed the man next to him. That man looked. Then he said something low, and 2 more looked up. Eleanor kept her chin level. She'd learned early that the moment you dropped your chin, you'd already lost. She walked toward the cookhouse because that was where she was supposed to go, and because it gave her something to move toward instead of standing still under all those eyes. She'd made it about halfway across the yard when the voice came from behind her. "Hey." She stopped, turned. The broad-chested man had followed her. 3 others stood a few feet back, not quite part of it, but not leaving either. "You the new cook?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Eleanor said. "Eleanor Hayes. The agency in Billings sent me." The man looked her over the way you'd look at a horse you were skeptical about. Slow and thorough, not bothering to hide it. "You cook for a working ranch before," he said. "I ran my own bakery in Missouri for 2 years," she said. "Before that, I cooked for a boarding house outside of St. Joseph. 30 men, 3 meals a day. A bakery." He said the word like it tasted strange. "This ain't a bakery, miss. This is a cattle operation. We work from before sunrise to after dark. We need food that sticks, not something you put a ribbon on." "I understand," Eleanor said. "You sure? Because you look like you came up here to sell us cakes at a church social." The men behind him laughed, not loud but enough. Eleanor felt the heat move up the back of her neck. She kept her voice even. "I can cook whatever you need. Give me a kitchen and a list of what you've got, and I'll have supper on the table tonight." The man studied her a moment longer. Then he shook his head like he'd already decided something and walked away without telling her what it was. Eleanor turned back toward the cookhouse and kept moving. Inside the place was a wreck. The cook stove was crusted with old grease. 2 of the burner plates were cracked. A cast-iron pot in the corner had something hardened in the bottom that had been there long enough to turn black. The flour bin was half full, but had not been sealed properly, and when Eleanor pressed her finger into the surface, she felt the grit of weevils. 3 of the shelves along the east wall were pulling away from the studs. A rain stain spread across the ceiling above the prep table, brown at the edges and soft-looking at the center. She set her bag on the cleanest surface she could find, and stood there for a moment, just breathing. All right, she thought. All right. You've started from worse. She had. The bakery fire in Springfield had left her with nothing but the clothes she was wearing and the recipe book she'd grabbed off the wall on her way out. She'd rebuilt from that. She could rebuild from this. She rolled up her sleeves, found a bucket and a stiff brush under the sink, and went to work. She was still scrubbing the stove when the door opened behind her. She didn't look up immediately. She figured it was one of the hands come to tell her something else she was doing wrong. But the footsteps were different, heavier and deliberate. One set of boots moving slowly like a man who didn't hurry for anything. She looked up. Howe was standing in the doorway, filling most of it. 6 feet and some maybe 220 pounds of him. All of it. Hard-looking, in the way that comes not from a gymnasium, but from years of actual work. Dark brown hair cut short on the sides, longer on top, pushed back off his forehead. A close-trimmed beard going a little gray at the jaw. Skin the color of creek-washed copper from working outdoors every day of his adult life. He wore a canvas work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow and the kind of worn leather belt that doesn't have a decoration on it because the man who bought it was thinking about function, not appearance. Howe was looking at her the way she'd been looking at the cookhouse when she first walked in. Taking stock. Not unkind exactly, but not warm either. "Mr. Morgan," she said. "That's right," he said. His voice was low and flat, the kind that didn't waste movement on inflection. "Eleanor Hayes," she said. I can see what you're doing." He looked around the cookhouse, taking in the condition of it. He didn't seem surprised. "How bad is it?" "The stove needs cleaning, and the 2 front burner plates are cracked," she said. "I'll need new ones before I can get full heat. The flour's got weevils, so I'll need fresh. I can work around most of the rest for tonight, but if you want me to cook proper meals consistently, some things need fixing." He nodded once slow. "I'll get someone on the burner plates tomorrow. Flour I can have brought up from the supply shed by noon." He paused. "Anything else?" "The shelves on the east wall," she said. "They're pulling free. If one of them comes down while I've got hot pots on the prep table, somebody's going to get hurt." He looked at the shelves. He looked back at her. "I'll send somebody this afternoon," he said. "Thank you," she said. He didn't move toward the door. He stayed where he was, one shoulder against the frame, and he was quiet long enough that Eleanor went back to scrubbing the stove, because standing still under that kind of silence didn't do either of them any good. "You know what you're walking into here," he said after a moment. It wasn't quite a question. "The agency told me it was a working cattle ranch," she said. 25 hands, remote location, no town closer than 9 miles. "That's the practical part," he said. "I mean the rest of it." She looked up again. "My men have been without a cook for 3 weeks," he said. "They're tired, and they're short-tempered, and they've been living on their own cooking, which is not good. They're going to be hard on you at first. Not because they're bad men, but because they don't believe a woman alone can handle this place." Eleanor set the brush down and straightened up. "Do you believe that, Mr. Morgan?" He looked at her steadily. "I believe in watching what a person does before I decide what they can handle." It was not encouragement. It was not doubt. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her since she'd stepped off the wagon, and she found she respected it. "Then watch," she said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. More like the shadow of one there and gone before it committed to anything. He pushed off the doorframe. "Supper's expected at 6, he said. "The men eat in here or on the tables outside if the weather holds." He glanced at the ceiling stain. "For their sake, I'd recommend outside tonight." Then he was gone. Eleanor worked through the afternoon without stopping. She sorted the flour, found enough good stock to work with. She located dried beans and a side of salt pork in the cold storage. There were onions hanging in a mesh bag from a ceiling hook, garlic, dried herbs in small labeled tins that had not been touched in a while but were still good. She found cornmeal. She found lard and a crock of preserved butter. She found dried apples and a quart of sorghum molasses. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She made cornbread from scratch, 2 full pans. She put the beans on low with the salt pork and onions and let them go slow, the way her grandmother had taught her, saying that beans didn't respond well to hurrying. She found a deep roasting pan and cut the remaining pork she found in cold storage into pieces and put them in with garlic and dried sage, sliding it into the oven to render low and slow. By 5:30, the cookhouse smelled like a home. She stepped outside to set the long trestle tables that ran along the outside wall of the cookhouse, and she noticed 2 things. First, the men had started drifting in from the fields early. Not a lot, 4 or 5, but they were close enough that she knew they'd smelled the food. Second, the man with the sun-cracked face who'd challenged her in the yard was standing near the water trough with 2 others watching her set the table. He wasn't hiding the fact that he was watching. He wanted her to see it. She set this table and went back inside. At 6 o'clock, she rang the bell. They came. All 25 of them. Some still pulling off work gloves, others wiping hands on their trousers. They filled the benches and the chairs shoulder to shoulder, and they were loud with each other in the careless way of men who spend all day in each other's company and don't feel the need to be polite about it. Eleanor came out of the cookhouse with the first pot of beans and set it on the table. The talking slowed, not stopped slowed. The smell had reached them, and they were responding to it whether they meant to or not. She went back for the cornbread, then the pork, then a pot of coffee. She stood at the end of the table, and she said, "It's ready." For about 20 seconds, nobody did anything. Then the man at the nearest end reached for the beans, and after that, it moved the way eating always moves when hungry men are sitting in front of food. Eleanor went back inside. She had more coffee to make, and the washing up to start. She was elbow deep in the rinse bucket when she heard the first voice carry through the window. "What in the hell is this?" She went still. "I ain't eating this." A different voice. "She put sage in the pork." A third. "Who put sage in pork? That's a woman's thing." "Tastes like something my grandmother made." Not said warmly. And then the sound she'd been braced for since she arrived, chairs scraping. The rhythmic, deliberate scraping of men, pushing back from a table one after another, like a signal passing down the line. She dried her hands on her apron, walked to the door, opened it. 12 of the 25 were standing. Some had eaten a few bites, some hadn't touched their plates at all. They were moving away from the table with the particular energy of men making a point, not men who were simply full. The sun-cracked man. She'd learn later, his name was Del Pruitt. Lead hand, 14 years on, Morgan Mountain was one of the standing ones. He looked directly at her when the door opened. "No offense, miss," he said in a tone that indicated significant offense. "But we need a ranch cook, not a parlor cook. This ain't what we're used to." "What are you used to?" she asked. "Plain food, no fussing." "Pork and beans with cornbread," she said. "I'm not sure what's fussed about it." "The sage," said another man, "and the cornbread's got something sweet in it." "A tablespoon of molasses," she said, "to balance the corn." "We don't need it balanced," Del Pruitt said. He set his hat back on his head. He'd taken it off when he sat down, which told her some things hadn't been bred out of him yet. "We need it fed." He walked away. The others who were standing followed. 13 men in the end stayed at the table and finished eating. 12 walked away. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the cookhouse and watched them go. She counted them as they went quietly so she'd know the exact number, so she wouldn't tell herself later that it wasn't as bad as it was. 12 men. She went back inside. She put the leftover food away. She washed every dish and pot and laid them to dry on the clean cloth she'd spread over the prep table. She banked the stove fire for morning. She swept the floor. Then she sat down on the one stool in the corner of the cookhouse, and she pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes for a long moment. She was not going to cry. She had decided that on the wagon ride up from Billings, when she was staring at the backs of the horses and thinking about the bakery she'd lost, and the money she didn't have, and the fact that this job at a remote mountain ranch was the only offer she'd gotten in 2 months. She had decided then that whatever happened, she was not going to let herself cry over any of it, because crying didn't put flour in the bin or wood on the fire. She took her hands away from her eyes and looked at the recipe book sitting on the corner of the prep table where she'd set it when she first came in. It was old. The cover was warped from the Springfield fire, the edges of the pages browned and soft. Her grandmother's handwriting filled the first half of it, neat and slanted pencil that had faded to silver. Her own handwriting filled the back half, tighter and more hurried, the notes of a woman cooking under pressure. On the third page from the front, in her grandmother's hand: "When nothing works, make the thing they didn't know they needed." Eleanor sat with that for a moment. Then she stood up, went to the cold storage, and took stock of what she had. She found the peaches by accident. Behind the cold storage there was a door she'd thought was a closet. It was, in a manner of speaking, a lean-to addition, built against the back of the cookhouse, open on one side to the north-facing slope where the temperature stayed lower. On the floor of it, in the deep shadow, she found 3 wooden crates. She dragged the first one into the light. Peaches. Late season, dried on the tree before they were picked. The skins slightly wrinkled, but the flesh still holding. Mountain peaches from the wild trees that grew on the upper slope. She guessed small and dense and intensely sweet. The kind that didn't look like much, but tasted like something a person would travel a long distance to eat again. There had to be 40 pounds of them. She sat back on her heels and looked at those peaches for a long moment. Then she went and relit the stove. She worked through the night. She'd done it before. The bakery in Springfield had been a one-woman operation for most of its life, and there had been plenty of nights she'd worked from 10 in the evening until 4 in the morning to have product ready for the morning rush. Her body knew how to work tired. It knew how to pace itself, when to push and when to ease, how to stay standing when everything wanted to sit down. She peeled and sliced the peaches by lamplight, humming to herself. Sometimes, not any particular song, just sound, the kind of thing you do when you're alone and the work is repetitive and the night is very quiet. She made the dough from memory. Her grandmother's crust, the one that used lard instead of butter and had a tablespoon of vinegar in it that nobody could ever identify, but everyone agreed made it different from every other crust they'd had. She pressed it flat and fitted it into 6 pie tins, the largest she'd found in the cookhouse, crimping the edges, the way she'd been taught, folding the dough over on itself and pressing with the heel of her thumb. She made the filling with brown sugar and cinnamon and a little nutmeg and a pinch of salt, because sweet things needed a little bit of bitter to remind you how sweet they were. She got 4 pies into the oven just after midnight, and the other 2 went in when those came out. By 2 in the morning, 6 peach pies sat cooling on the prep table, and the inside of the cookhouse smelled like the very best version of summer. Eleanor sat on her stool in the corner with a cup of coffee and looked at them. She didn't know if it would work. She didn't know if Del Pruitt would take one bite and set his fork down and walk away again, just to prove he could, or if the others who'd left would decide that eating her food meant admitting something they weren't willing to admit. But she knew the pies were good. She knew that in the same way she knew certain things not from thinking about them, but from the knowledge that lived in her hands and her memory, and the particular quiet that settles in when you've done something right. She'd done something right. That would have to be enough for now. She was at the stove making biscuits at 5:15 in the morning when she heard boots on the ground outside, still a distance away. She didn't look up from the biscuit dough. She kept her hands moving, pressing and folding, the familiar rhythm of it. The door opened. "You're up early." It was Caleb Morgan. He was dressed for work, the same canvas shirt as yesterday, or one very much like it. He looked like a man who'd slept in the 5 or 6 hours he required and risen without difficulty. The way people who've spent years rising before dawn do it without drama. "I never went to bed," she said without particular emphasis. He came a few steps into the cookhouse and stopped. She heard it when it reached him, the moment the smell of the pies registered. There was a small pause in his movement, nearly imperceptible. "You cooked last night," he said. "For this morning," she said. "The biscuits are for breakfast, the pies are for supper, or I'll put them out midday if you think that's better." He was quiet. She looked up. How was looking at the 6 pies on the prep table, with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not hunger exactly, though that was part of it. Something more complicated. Something she'd seen in the faces of people who were surprised by a feeling they hadn't expected to have. "Peaches," he said almost to himself. "I found 3 crates in the lean-to," she said. "I hope that's all right. It seemed a waste to leave them." He looked at her then. "My wife planted those trees," he said. 8 years ago. She liked peaches." A pause. "Nobody's done anything with them since she died." Eleanor held his gaze. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "No," he said. "You didn't." He looked at the pies again, and whatever had been in his face a moment ago, he'd put it away somewhere. "They're good trees. She'd be glad somebody finally used them." I didn't say anything else about it. He looked at the biscuits she was cutting, and he said, "How many can you get out of that batch?" 3 dozen, she said. "More if I roll them thinner, but I won't do that." "Good," he said. And then after a moment, "The men who walked out last night, that was Del Pruitt's doing." "I figured," she said. "He ran off the last 2 cooks," Caleb said. "Wasn't entirely their fault the leaving. He's a good worker and a hard writer, but he's got a fixed idea about how things ought to be, and he doesn't always remember that his ideas aren't the law." "He doesn't seem like a cruel man," Eleanor said carefully. "He seems like a man who's decided something and won't be talked out of it." Caleb considered that. "That's an accurate reading." "I'm not interested in being talked about," Eleanor said. "I'm interested in cooking a good supper tonight and a better one tomorrow. If the men decide to eat it, that's their choice." He looked at her with that same weighing expression she'd seen in the doorway yesterday, like he was updating something. "I'll be at the table tonight," he said. She nodded once. "Then I'll make sure there's enough coffee." He almost smiled again, closer this time. Then he pulled the door open and left. Breakfast went better than supper. Not perfectly. 8 of the 25 men ate in near silence and didn't look at her when she refilled their coffee. 2 made a point of commenting on how the biscuits were too soft a criticism that she was fairly certain was not about the biscuits. Del Pruitt sat at the far end of the table and ate everything on his plate, which she noted because she was paying attention to things like that. But 17 men ate well, and 4 of them said something to her on the way out. "Good biscuits. Better than what I've been making. You got any of that coffee left?" And one man, young, maybe 19, red-haired and sunburned, paused near the door and said, "Are those really peach pies for tonight?" "Yes," she said. He nodded like this was important information and went on his way. She spent the day working. She deep-cleaned the second half of the cookhouse, the half she hadn't gotten to yesterday. She reorganized the cold storage so she could find what she needed without wasting time. She made a list of supplies she needed and left it on the porch of the main house where she'd seen men leaving notes for Caleb. She found the mountain garden. She hadn't been looking for it. She'd gone around the back of the cookhouse to see what condition the woodpile was in, and she'd followed the slope upward a little way out of curiosity, and there it was behind a stand of young pines that had grown up in what she guessed used to be a cleared view. It was overgrown, but not gone. A kitchen garden, substantial once. She could see the bones of it in the orderly spacing of things that had naturalized and spread, but still held their original pattern. Sage. Thyme. What was probably once a bed of kitchen herbs, now gone wild and sprawling. And further up where the slope leveled off briefly before climbing again, a row of 6 small trees. Not peaches, something else. She pulled back a branch and looked. Plums. Green still not close to ready but there. And beyond those, the vine-spread tangle of what might be raspberries. She stood in that overgrown garden behind the cookhouse, and she felt something she hadn't felt since before the fire in Springfield. Possibility. That evening she put out supper at 6 with the same bell she'd used the night before. They came again. All 25. She noticed that some of the men who'd walked out last night came to the table with a slightly different quality of quiet. Not hostile, not warm, just careful. Like men who'd thought about something and weren't sure yet what they'd decided. The supper was roasted chicken. 2 birds she'd found in the cold storage rubbed with garlic and the wild thyme from the garden. Fried potatoes with onion. Green beans slow-cooked with bacon. Fresh biscuits. and coffee, and the 6 peach pies. She brought them out after the main course 2 at a time and set them on the table. The talking stopped. Not because anyone decided to stop talking. It stopped the way all talking stops when something enters a room that is more important than whatever was being said. The pies were golden. The lattice crust had browned perfectly, and the peach filling had bubbled up through the gaps and cooked down into something dark and sweet and trembling. The smell of them was extraordinary cinnamon and fruit and butter, and the particular high note that comes when peaches are this good and you haven't done too much to them. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Del Pruitt reached out and cut himself a piece. I didn't say anything. He just put the piece on his plate and ate it. The red-haired boy, who'd asked about the pies that morning, ate his piece so fast he had to go back for another and seemed embarrassed about it. An older man at the middle of the table ate slowly with the concentration of someone trying to identify something. He set his fork down eventually and looked up not at Eleanor, but at some point in the middle distance, and his expression was the expression of a man who is remembering something. The pies were gone in 20 minutes, every last crumb. Eleanor was at the stove when she heard the boots behind her. She turned. Del Pruitt was standing in the doorway of the cookhouse. He had his hat in his hand, which she hadn't expected. He looked uncomfortable. A big man made smaller by being in the wrong, which was its own kind of satisfaction, though she tried not to let herself feel it too much. Those were my mother's trees, he said. Before she passed, she made peach preserves every August, sent a jar to every family between here and Billings. He stopped, started again. I reckon I didn't think about them trees belonging to anyone but her. Eleanor waited. I was hard on you yesterday, he said. That wasn't fair. No, she said. It wasn't. He nodded. He'd expected that, or something like it. I won't trouble you again, he said. I appreciate that, she said. He put his hat back on and stepped out. Eleanor turned back to the stove. She stood there a moment, her hands flat on the cool iron of the work surface, just breathing. 24 hours. She'd been here 24 hours. She picked up the dish brush and went back to work. Caleb Morgan came to the cookhouse at 8 o'clock when the yard was quiet, and most of the men had gone to the bunkhouse. He came in without knocking, which she was beginning to understand was just his way. He stopped at the prep table, looked at the empty pie tins, and looked up at her. Not a scrap left, he said. No, she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Then Del Pruitt came to see me before supper. Said he was going to apologize to you. He did, she said. Del Pruitt, Caleb said slowly, has not apologized to a living human being in the 11 years I've known him. She kept washing dishes. What did you put in those pies? He said. Peaches, she said. Sugar, cinnamon, nutmeg, salt, my grandmother's crust. That's all. She considered the question. I put them on the table, she said. I think that's the part people don't account for. He stood there a moment longer. She could feel him thinking that particular quality of silence that meant a person was working something out. The men who walked out last night, he said at last. They'll be at the table tomorrow. I know, she said. He looked at her again, that steady taking stock look that she was getting used to. You planned this, he said. I cooked peach pies, she said. What people plan and what people do aren't always the same thing. Howe was quiet again. Then he said, Good night, Miss Hayes. Good night, Mr. Morgan, she said. He went to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame, his back to her. My wife's name was Clara, he said. She planted those trees the spring after we came up the mountain. Said she wasn't going to live somewhere that didn't have peaches in the summer. A pause. She was right about most things. He went out into the dark. Eleanor stood still for a moment after he left her hands in the rinse water, listening to the sound of his boots fade across the yard. Then she pulled her hands out of the water, dried them on her apron, and picked up her grandmother's recipe book from the corner of the prep table. She opened it to the page with the peach pie. Below her grandmother's recipe in the margin in her own handwriting, she'd added a note years ago that she'd forgotten until just now. The best food is food that makes people remember something worth keeping. Outside somewhere up on the dark mountain slope a nightbird was calling. Eleanor listened to it for a moment. Then she closed the recipe book, set it back in its corner, and went to bank the stove for morning. She was not going to cry. She was going to cook breakfast. And tomorrow, she was going to find out what else was growing in that garden. The next morning, Eleanor found a note on the cookhouse door. It was written on the back of a feed receipt, the handwriting blocky and uneven, like a man who didn't write often enough to be comfortable at it. Burner plates coming today. Shelves fixed yesterday while you were cooking. CM. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket and started the breakfast fire. She didn't know why she kept it. She told herself it was just a record, in case there was ever a question about what had been promised and what had been delivered. But the truth was simpler than that, and she knew it even if she didn't say it out loud. It was the first time since she'd arrived that anyone had followed through on something they'd said they'd do. In Springfield, people had made her promises, the way they gave out handshakes, easy, weightless, forgotten by the time they reached the door. Her business partner had promised her he'd paid the insurance on the bakery. He hadn't. The fire had taken everything, and all she'd gotten afterward were more promises that turned to smoke as fast as the building had. A note on the back of a feed receipt wasn't much, but it was real. She got the biscuits going and put a pot of oatmeal on low and sliced the last of the cured ham into a cast-iron pan, and by 6 o'clock when the bell rang, she had a table set that smelled like a place where people were cared for. Every single one of the 25 men came to breakfast that morning, including the 12 who'd walked out 2 nights before. They didn't say anything about it. They didn't apologize, didn't acknowledge what had happened. Just took their seats, like men who'd made a quiet private decision and weren't interested in discussing it. Del Pruitt sat in his usual place at the far end. He didn't look at her, but he was there, and when she put the coffee down in front of him he said, "Thank you, ma'am," and that was enough. Caleb Morgan came in at 6:15 after the men had settled. He moved through the cookhouse without ceremony, poured his own coffee, and sat at the short end of the table near the door, a little apart from the crew, the way a man does when he's the one responsible for everything and needs to stay separate enough to see it all. He ate without talking. But once when she came out to refill the coffee pot, she caught him watching her with an expression she'd learned to recognize in the week she'd been here. Not attraction, not judgment. Appraisal. The way a man watches something he's still trying to categorize. She refilled his coffee without comment and went back inside. After the men had gone out to work, she leaned against the doorframe of the cookhouse for a moment and let herself breathe. "You're still here," she thought. "That counts for something." 2 days later, she found the second thing they'd all been ignoring. She'd gone back to the garden. She'd been going back every morning after breakfast before the main cooking work began, pulling at the overgrowth methodically, seeing what was under it. The raspberry canes she'd spotted on the first visit were real and substantial. A long, unpruned tangle of them running along the upper edge of the garden where the slope leveled. They were past their first fruit, but still producing at the tips small late berries that were intensely tart. She was working her way along the cane when her boot caught something, and she stumbled and grabbed the nearest cane to steady herself, thorns and all. She straightened up, pressing her hand against her thigh, and looked down at what she'd tripped over. A flat stone maybe 2 feet across, half buried in the dirt. She crouched and worked it loose, and underneath it was a gap, maybe a handspan deep, filled with leaves and debris. She cleared it out with a stick and found at the bottom a small tin box. She sat back and looked at it a moment before she opened it. Inside, folded in a square of oilcloth that had kept out the moisture, was a piece of paper. The writing on it was a woman's hand, careful and deliberate. It was a recipe for something called mountain honey cake, using ingredients that included wild honeycomb and dried lavender, and something annotated as the purple flower from the east slope, not the ones by the creek. At the bottom, in smaller writing, "C, in case I'm not here to make it. Clara." Eleanor sat very still in the overgrown garden with that piece of paper in her hands, and she felt something that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite recognition, but lived somewhere between the two. Clara Morgan, Caleb's wife. The woman who had planted the peach trees and built this garden and left recipes hidden under stones for a husband who might need them someday. The woman who had understood that food was not just food. Eleanor folded the paper carefully back into its oilcloth, put it in her apron pocket beside Caleb's note, and went back to work. She didn't tell Caleb about it right away. She wasn't sure why. It wasn't hers to keep, she knew that, but she needed a day to think about what it meant and how to give it to him in a way that didn't feel like opening something that had been closed for a reason. In the meantime, she cooked. She found honeycomb in the cold storage. 2 sealed jars she'd thought were regular honey, and when she opened one and the smell hit her, she understood immediately. Wild honeycomb from the mountain bees, darker and more complex than anything from a kept hive, with a resinous backnote that came from whatever the bees were working, probably the pine flowers on the upper slope. She didn't have lavender, but she had the dried herbs from the garden tins, and she found one she hadn't identified yet. Tiny dried purple flowers in a small wax-sealed jar with no label, and when she crushed one between her fingers, the smell was exactly what she was looking for. She made the cake on a Wednesday afternoon between the noon meal and supper prep. She worked from Clara's recipe with only the small adjustments that any cook makes when the ingredients are almost but not quite what's written down, and when it came out of the oven, it was something she'd never made before and couldn't have invented on her own. Dense and fragrant, the honey dark all the way through, the crumb close and moist. She was still looking at it when she heard someone at the door. It was the red-haired boy, Tommy, she'd learned. 19 years old, first season on a real cattle ranch, homesick, in the way young men got homesick when they were too proud to say so. He'd been coming around the cookhouse on small pretexts for days. A cup of coffee, refill a question about supper, once just to see if there was anything that needed carrying. "Is that a cake?" he said. "It is," she said. "What kind?" "I'm not entirely sure yet," she said honestly. "Come taste it and tell me." He looked startled, like he hadn't expected the invitation to be that direct. Then he came in, and she cut him a slice, and he ate it standing at the prep table, and the expression that crossed his face was one she'd seen before on people who had been handed something unexpected. "That tastes like home," he said. And then he looked embarrassed because he was 19 and didn't mean to say things like that out loud. "Good," Eleanor said quietly. "That's what it's supposed to taste like." He set his plate down and left without saying anything else, but she heard him stop just outside the door, and after a moment, he came back to the doorway. "Miss Hayes," he said. "Yes, Tommy." "There's a man coming up the road, a rider from the south. He's been sitting at the edge of the property for about 10 minutes, and he ain't moving." Eleanor dried her hands. "Does he look like trouble?" "I don't know," Tommy said. "But Mr. Morgan doesn't know he's there. Nobody's told him." "Then go tell him," she said. Tommy went. Eleanor stayed in this cookhouse and listened. She heard Caleb's voice in the yard a few minutes later, short and sharp, giving instructions. Heard boots moving with purpose. Heard the particular silence that falls over a working ranch when something has shifted from ordinary to watchful. 20 minutes passed. Then Caleb came into the cookhouse. He came in the way. He came in when something was wrong, not rushing. Caleb Morgan never rushed, but with an economy of movement that meant he was thinking ahead of himself. He stood at the prep table and looked at the cake, and for a moment didn't say anything about what was out in the yard. "What's that?" he said. "Clara's recipe," Eleanor said. "I found it in the garden, under a stone in a tin box wrapped in oilcloth." She reached into her apron pocket and put the folded paper on the prep table in front of him. "I should have given it to you sooner. I'm sorry." He looked at the paper without picking it up. Something moved through his face, not quickly, not dramatically, but deeply. The way change moves in a person when they feel something they've been holding down finally press too hard against the surface. He picked up the paper, unfolded it slowly. "Read it." He stood there a long moment. "She hid it," he said, not a question. "Under a flat stone at the top of the garden," Eleanor said. "She wrote your initial at the bottom." He folded the paper back along its original creases carefully and held it in his hand. He didn't put it in his pocket. He just held it like a man who doesn't know yet where to put something important. "The rider in the south field," Eleanor said, because he'd come in here for a reason that wasn't the cake. "Who is he?" Caleb set the paper down on the prep table near the cake. His name is Gareth Lyle, he said. He works for a man named Preston Holt, who owns about 40,000 acres in the Yellowstone Valley. A pause. Holt's been trying to buy this property for 3 years. And you're not interested in selling? No. But Lyle came anyway. Lyle comes every few months to remind me the offer's still open, Caleb said. Every time he comes, the number's a little higher, and every time some of my men have a few less reasons to stay. Eleanor processed that. He's recruiting, she said. Caleb looked at her. What? He's not just delivering an offer, she said. He's coming to the property, he sits where your men can see him. He lets the idea of a bigger operation with better money do the talking. He doesn't have to say anything. The visit itself does the work. Caleb was quiet. How many men did you lose last year? She asked. 4, he said. 2 went to Holt's operation. 1 went north. 1 just left. And the year before? He looked at her with that expression again, recalibrating. 3, he said. So he comes and men leave, she said. Not because you're a bad employer or this is a bad ranch, because he's planting doubt and doubt grows if you leave it alone. Caleb set his hands flat on the prep table. He was quiet for long enough that Eleanor knew he was not dismissing what she'd said. He was sitting with it, which was different. What would you do? He said. It was not a rhetorical question. She knew the difference. Feed them better, she said simply. Not just food. A reason to stay. A reason to feel like what they're doing here matters. A man who feels like he belongs somewhere is harder to recruit than a man who feels like he's just passing through. Caleb looked at her. You think food is going to keep 25 cowboys from leaving for better wages? I think food is one part of it, she said. I think the way a man is treated is a bigger part. But I can control the food. The rest is yours. He was quiet again. Then he reached out and touched the edge of the cake tin, just the edge with 2 fingers not quite picking it up. This is from her recipe, he said. Yes. Is it? He stopped, started again. Is it good? Tommy said it tasted like home, Eleanor said. Something shifted in Caleb Morgan's face that she'd never seen there before. It was brief, and he put it away before she could study it, but it was there. I'll go talk to Lyle, he said. He took the piece of paper from the prep table, folded it once more, and put it in his shirt pocket. Then he went out. That evening, Gareth Lyle ate supper at the Morgan Mountain table. She hadn't expected that. Caleb had invited him. She'd heard it from Tommy, who heard everything, as young men in large groups inevitably do not, because Caleb wanted his company, but because, as Tommy related, Mr. Morgan said something about letting a man see what he's trying to take before he decides how hard to try. Lyle was younger than Eleanor expected. Mid-30s, well-dressed for ranch country, the kind of lean and sharp-featured man who'd learned early that looking competent was half of being trusted. He sat at the table with the crew, and he was smooth about it. Easy manners, the right kind of questions, the sort of conversation that made a man feel noticed without feeling assessed. Eleanor watched him through the cookhouse window while she plated the food. She'd made a full supper. Beef braised low and slow with wild onions and dried herbs. Roasted root vegetables from the garden. Fresh bread, the real kind. Not quick bread that she'd started that morning so it would have time to rise properly. And for dessert, what remained of the honey cake sliced and set out on a board with a small crock of whipped cream she'd made from the morning's fresh milk. She brought it out herself. All of it. And she put it on that table like she meant it. The conversation changed when the food arrived. It always did. That was the thing people never understood about cooking for a crowd. It wasn't just about feeding people. It was about the moment when food appeared on the table, and the noise and the posturing and the performance of it all settled into something more honest, because hunger was honest, and so was satisfaction. Lyle ate. He ate everything she put in front of him, and she watched him do it from the doorway, and she watched the moment the honey cake reached him. He took a bite, set his fork down, picked it up again, ate slowly. When he looked up, he looked straight at her, and his expression was not the smooth expression of a man managing a situation. It was something involuntary and surprised. "Who made this?" he said. "I did," Eleanor said. "This is..." He stopped. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "From my grandmother," she said. "And from the garden behind this cookhouse." He looked around the table. He looked at the men who were eating with the settled, comfortable focus of people who'd been well-fed consistently enough to trust that the food would keep being good. He looked at Del Pruitt, who was eating his third piece of bread, with the contentment of a man who'd reached some kind of peace. He looked at Tommy, who was scraping the last of the cream from the board with the edge of his spoon, and not embarrassed about it. He looked at Caleb Morgan, who was eating quietly at the end of the table, and who was watching Lyle watch all of this. Lyle looked back at Eleanor. "Preston Holt would pay very well for a cook like you," he said. He said it pleasantly casually, like he was offering information rather than making a move. Eleanor looked at him calmly. "I'm not looking for a different position," she said. "Will you need more coffee?" His mouth moved in something that was almost a smile. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Thank you." She went back inside. Lyle left after supper. He shook hands with Caleb in the yard, said something too low for Eleanor to hear from the cookhouse window, and rode south. 3 of the men watched him go with that particular stillness that meant they'd been thinking something they hadn't decided yet. Eleanor noted which 3 and went on cooking. Caleb came in at 8 o'clock, as he'd started to do most evenings while she was finishing the cleanup. He poured himself the last of the coffee and leaned against the prep table and said nothing for a while, which she'd come to understand meant he was processing something and would get to it when he was ready. "You handled Lyle well," he said eventually. "I didn't handle him," she said. "I cooked supper and answered a question." "You answered it right," he said. "He expected you to either be flattered or look at me to see if you were allowed to answer. You did neither." She glanced at him. "Why would I look at you to see if I was allowed to answer a question put to me?" He almost smiled. "You wouldn't," he said. "That's what I'm saying." She dried the last pot and hung it on its hook. "Did you know he was going to do that? Try to recruit me?" "I suspected," Caleb said. "Lyle is thorough. He would have heard about you." "From who?" "From whoever he pays to tell him things." He set his coffee cup down. "I told you when you arrived that Holt's been trying to buy this place for 3 years. That's true. What I didn't say was how he does it. He doesn't just offer money. He takes things. A man here, a man there. A piece of fence line that goes wrong in a way that's a little too convenient. A supply shipment that's a little too late." He paused. "A succession of cooks who couldn't last more than 2 weeks." Eleanor went still. "The first one left because Del Pruitt made things uncomfortable," Caleb said. "That was genuine. Del can be genuine about that kind of thing. The second one left because someone told her the water up here made people sick. That wasn't true. The third one left after someone went through her things." He looked at Eleanor steadily. "I don't know which of those things would have been Holt's doing, and which would have just been men behaving badly. But 3 cooks in 3 months is a pattern." "Why are you telling me this now?" Eleanor said. "Because you should know what you're in," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Are you worried I'll leave?" He held her gaze. "I'm worried something will happen that makes you feel like you have to." It was the most direct thing he'd said to her since she'd arrived. She could feel the weight of it, not the weight of threat, but the weight of honesty, which sometimes pressed harder. "I don't leave when things get difficult," she said. "I left Springfield because there was nothing left to stay for. This is different." "How is it different?" "Because there's something here worth staying for," she said. "The garden, the kitchen, the work." A pause. "The people." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Del Pruitt asked me today if you were going to be here through the winter." "What did you tell him?" "I said I hoped so." He looked at the prep table, then back at her. "He said to tell you he'd fix the water pump on the east side of the cookhouse if you wanted. It's been slow since spring." Eleanor felt something quiet and warm move through her chest. Del Pruitt, who had not apologized to a living person in 11 years, was offering to fix her water pump. "Tell him I'd appreciate that," she said. Caleb nodded once. He picked up his coffee cup, finished the last cold swallow in it, and set it in the wash basin. "Good night, Miss Hayes," he said. "Good night, Mr. Morgan," she said. He went to the door. He stopped. "I ate 2 pieces of that cake," he said without turning around. "I want you to know that." He went out before she could answer. The next 2 weeks moved with the rhythm of a place settling back into itself. The water pump got fixed. Del Pruitt showed up one morning with Tommy at his side carrying tools and spent 2 hours on it without being asked again. The shelves held. The burner plates worked. Eleanor began working through the garden, systematically pruning and clearing, and finding things that had been left to go wild. And every time she found something new, she felt the same small beat of satisfaction that she recognized now as the feeling she'd been trying to get back since Springfield. She was beginning to learn the men, not just their names and their preferences. Though she'd learned those too. Tommy wanted his coffee black and strong. Del Pruitt didn't eat onions, but would eat anything with onions if they were cooked soft enough that he couldn't identify them. The older man at the middle of the table, whose name was Hector, always ate the bread first before anything else, as if establishing something. She was learning the patterns of them, the shape of how they moved through a day. She learned that the crew's mood shifted on Sundays, when the work was lighter and the men had time to think about whatever they'd left behind to come up a mountain and work cattle for wages. She learned that Tuesday mornings were hard because Monday was always the heaviest work day. She learned that the quickest way to change the temperature of a difficult room was to bring out something that smelled good before they sat down, not after. She cooked for all of it. Heartier food on the hard days. Something sweet on Sundays. Something that took time and showed it a long braise of risen bread when she felt the men needed to know that someone had cared enough to plan ahead for them. Caleb noticed. She could see it in the way he watched the crew at the table, the small recalibrations in his expression. When something she'd done shifted the energy of the room in a way he hadn't anticipated. I didn't always come by in the evenings now. Some nights the work kept him out past dark, and she'd clean up and bank the fire and go to the small room off the back of the cookhouse that served as her quarters without seeing him. On those nights, she found herself listening for his boots on the porch longer than she should have, and she told herself it was just a habit, the way you listen for a regular sound, because its absence is notable. She told herself that. She was not entirely convinced. The trouble arrived on a Thursday 3 weeks after she'd come to Morgan Mountain. It arrived in the form of a letter. It came with the weekly supply wagon from town, and the driver handed it to her because she was the one who met the wagon at the gate as she always did to check the order and sign off on the delivery. It was addressed to her in handwriting she hadn't seen in 2 years and hoped never to see again. She held it without opening it for the better part of an afternoon. Then she sat down on her stool in the cookhouse after supper cleanup when the yard was quiet and the lamp was low, and she opened it. It was from a man named Warren Shea, her former business partner, the man who had not paid the insurance on the Springfield bakery. He'd found where she was working. She didn't know how. It didn't matter. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first told her he was in financial difficulty. The second said that he believed she'd been carrying a grudge unfairly, that the fire had been as much a loss for him as for her. Which was not true. He had walked away from it with money she didn't know about. She'd learned that later, and that he wanted to talk. The third paragraph told her that he was currently in Billings and intended to come up to Morgan Mountain Ranch to see her within the fortnight. She read it 3 times. Then she set it face down on the prep table and sat very still for a long moment. He's going to come here, she thought. He's going to come here and say the things he says, and the men will see it, and it will be another story about Eleanor Hayes, who couldn't hold her life together in Missouri and won't be able to hold it together here either. She pressed her hands flat on the table. She was not going to let that happen. She picked up the letter, folded it, and put it in her apron pocket alongside the other things she kept there. Then she stood up, straightened her apron, and went to find Caleb Morgan. I was in the barn. She found him there because Tommy had said that's where he usually was at this hour, if he wasn't at the main house, and Tommy, as she had established, knew where everyone was at any given time. Caleb was working on a piece of tack saddle leather across a stand, moving a conditioning cloth over it, with the methodical patience of a man who did this regularly, and found it, if not exactly pleasant, at least quieting. He looked up when she came in. Whatever he saw in her face made him stop what he was doing. "What's wrong?" he said. "I need to tell you something," she said. "About why I left Missouri." she told him. Not everything there were parts of it she wasn't ready to hand to anyone yet, but the material facts. The bakery, the partnership, Warren Shea's failure to pay the insurance, the fire, the loss, the letter that had arrived today. She told it plainly. The way you tell a thing, when you've decided the telling of it, matters more than how you look while you're telling it. She didn't embellish, didn't minimize, didn't try to make herself come out of it better than she had. When she finished, Caleb was quiet for long enough that she could hear the horses in their stalls and the wind moving over the barn roof. "You think he's going to come here and cause you trouble?" he said. "I think he's going to come here and be Warren Shea," she said, which amounts to the same thing. "What kind of trouble?" "The talking kind," she said. "He's good at talking. He has a way of making a story sound reasonable that makes you forget until later that the story isn't true." She looked at Caleb steadily. "I want you to know this before he arrives, so that when he tells you his version, you've already heard mine." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "You think I'd believe him over you," he said. "I think you'd be fair," she said. "Which means you'd listen to both sides. I just want to make sure you have both sides before he gets here." Something in his expression shifted, not softened exactly, but deepened. "You've been here 3 weeks, he said. "In 3 weeks I've watched you handle 40 men, a sabotaged reputation, Del Pruitt and Gareth Lyle. Whatever this man she has to say about you, it's not going to change what I've seen." Eleanor felt something in her chest pull tight in a way that was not unpleasant. "You don't know what he'll say," she said. "No," Caleb said. "But I know what I've seen." He set the conditioning cloth down. "If he comes here, I'll meet him at the gate." A pause. "He won't come onto this property without going through me first." She looked at him. He was entirely serious. There was nothing dramatic about it. It was just a fact stated the way facts were stated by a man who meant what he said and didn't need an audience. She took a breath. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. He picked up the conditioning cloth again. She turned to go. "Miss Hayes," he said. She turned back. "You didn't have to tell me," he said. "You could have dealt with it yourself, and I might never have known." "I know," she said. "Why did you—" She thought about it for a moment. "Because I'm tired of carrying things alone," she said. "And because I think you understand that better than most people." He looked at her, and the expression on his face in that moment was not the weighing, taking stock expression she'd grown accustomed to. It was something else entirely. Something that had not quite found its shape yet, but was pressing toward one. "Good night, Mr. Morgan," she said. "Good night," he said quietly. "Eleanor." It was the first time he'd used her name. She walked back across the dark yard to the cookhouse, and she did not look back, because if she looked back, she was afraid of what she might see on her own face, and she wasn't ready for that yet. Inside, she lit the lamp and sat down at the prep table and opened her grandmother's recipe book to no particular page, just to have something familiar under her hands. The ranch was quiet around her. Somewhere in the bunkhouse, one of the men was playing a harmonica, something slow and simple, and not quite a recognizable tune, just the shape of one. Eleanor sat with the recipe book and the lamplight and the distant harmonica, and thought about Warren Shea coming up this mountain road, and about Caleb Morgan standing at the gate, and about the fact that for the first time in 2 years, she was not facing something alone. She closed the recipe book. She got up and banked the fire. Tomorrow, she was going to start on the raspberry preserve. She'd found enough cane fruit this week to get 6 jars out of it, maybe 7, and if she did it right, they'd have something on the table through November when the fresh things were gone, and the mountain got cold, and the men needed reminding that summer had been real. She turned down the lamp. Outside, the harmonica had found its tune at last, something her grandmother used to hum while she cooked, though Eleanor couldn't have said the name of it. She stood in the dark cookhouse and listened to it for just a moment. Then she went to bed. Warren Shea arrived on a Monday. Eleanor knew he would. Warren had always liked Mondays. He said it was because people were weakest at the start of a week, still carrying the weight of whatever Sunday had brought them, not yet steady on their feet. She'd thought when he first told her that it was an odd thing for a business partner to say. She understood now that it wasn't odd at all. It was a blueprint. She was rolling biscuit dough when Tommy came through the cookhouse door at 7:15 in the morning, moving faster than his usual amble. "There's a man at the south gate," he said. "Well-dressed, driving a rented buggy from Billings by the look of the livery mark on the horse. He's asking for you by name." Eleanor kept rolling. "Is Mr. Morgan at the main house?" "Yes, ma'am." "Go tell him," she said. "Don't come back here. Stay with Mr. Morgan." Tommy hesitated in the doorway. "You going to be all right?" She looked up at him. 19 years old, sunburned and earnest and genuinely asking. "Yes," she said. "Go." He went. She finished the biscuits. She got them into the oven. She wiped her hands on her apron, straightened it, and walked out to the yard. Warren Shea was already through the gate. She didn't know how he'd gotten through. Caleb had said he'd meet him there, and Caleb was not a man who forgot what he'd said. But Warren was through, standing near the water trough with his hat in his hands and the particular expression he wore when he was performing contrition, which was the expression of a man who believed that looking sorry was the same as being sorry. He looked exactly like she remembered. 42 thick through the middle now, in a way he hadn't been 2 years ago. Hair a shade darker than it should be for a man his age, which meant he was still doing something to it. He wore a good coat. He always wore a good coat. "Eleanor," he said. "Mr. Shea," she said. She stopped 10 feet from him, and she did not close the distance. He smiled. It was a warm smile. He had a warm smile the way certain snakes had beautiful markings. It was real in its way, it just didn't mean what it appeared to mean. "You look well," he said. "Mountain air suits you." "What do you want, Warren?" The smile adjusted slightly. He was recalibrating, reading her tone, deciding which version of the conversation to attempt. She'd seen him do it 100 times, and she'd once found it charming the way he could navigate a room. Now she just watched it happen and felt nothing but a kind of tired clarity. "I want to talk," he said. "I wrote you a letter. I received it." "Then you know I'm in a difficult position." "I know what you wrote," she said. "I don't know what you want from me." He spread his hands. Reasonable. Open. "Eleanor, what happened in Springfield, the fire, the loss, I've carried that. I want you to know that. I've thought about it every day." "Have you?" she said. "I made a mistake," he said. "With the insurance. I know that. I was overextended, and I made a decision I shouldn't have made, and you paid for it. I want to make that right." She looked at him steadily. "How?" "I have an opportunity," he said. "A new venture in Billings. A proper restaurant, not a bakery, something that could be substantial. I have an investor interested. What I need is—" "A cook," she said. He paused. "A partner," he said carefully. "With your skills, Eleanor, we could build something real, something better than Springfield ever was." "With your investor's money," she said. "With solid backing, yes. And when this investor decides to pull out, or when the insurance lapses, or when the next fire comes, and Warren with you, there will always be a next fire. What happens then?" His expression flickered. Just for a second, the warmth slipped, and underneath it was something flat and practical and entirely unsentimental. Then it was back. "That's not fair," he said. "No," she said. "What wasn't fair was losing everything I'd built, because you decided my livelihood was a risk you could manage for me without telling me." The yard had gone quiet in the particular way that yards go quiet when people are paying attention without appearing to. Eleanor was aware without looking that Del Pruitt had stopped working somewhere to her left, that Tommy was nearby, that other men had found reasons to be in the vicinity. She was also aware a moment later of boots on the porch of the main house. She didn't look. She kept her eyes on Warren. "I think you should leave," she said. Warren looked past her shoulder. His expression changed again, this time to the one he used when he was recalculating odds. "Mr. Shea." Caleb's voice came from behind Eleanor, even and unhurried. She heard his boots on the ground as he came to stand level with her, not in front, not behind. Level. Warren looked at Caleb with the assessment he gave everyone who might be useful or might be an obstacle. "You must be the ranch owner," he said. He extended his hand. Warren Shea. Eleanor and I were business partners in Missouri. I've come to... I know who you are, Caleb said. He didn't take the hand. I know why you've come, and I think you've had the answer you came for. He paused. The gate's behind you. Warren's hand came down. The warmth in his expression cooled by several degrees. I don't believe I was speaking to you, he said. You were speaking on my property, Caleb said, which makes it my business. For a moment, Warren held Caleb's gaze, and Eleanor could see him measuring the size of the man, the steadiness of him, the complete absence of anything that could be mistaken for uncertainty. Warren was good at reading people, and what he was reading now was apparently sufficient, because his shoulders settled in the particular way that meant he'd decided this ground wasn't worth taking today. He put his hat back on. He looked at Eleanor. Think about it, he said. The offer stands. It doesn't, she said. He smiled one more time, thin and rearranged. Then he turned, walked to his buggy, and drove back through the gate. Eleanor stood in the yard and watched the dust settle after him. Her hands were at her sides, and they were steady. She was surprised by that. She'd thought they might shake. Del Pruitt walked past her toward the barn, and as he passed he said quietly without looking at her, "Good riddance." Then he kept walking. She almost laughed. She turned it into a breath instead. Caleb was still standing beside her. "You knew he'd try to go around me," she said. "I expected it," he said. "So I let him come through. Easier to have it in the open than spend the day wondering what he's doing at the gate." She looked at him. "You planned that." "I watched what needed to happen," he said, "and let it happen." She recognized her own words from 3 weeks ago returned to her. He'd been paying attention. "He won't come back," Caleb said. It wasn't a question. "No," she said. "He goes where the path is easy. I just made sure he understood this one wasn't." She went back to her biscuits. The week that followed was the kind of week that looked ordinary from the outside and felt from the inside like the ground had shifted under everything. Del Pruitt fixed 2 more things in the cookhouse without being asked: a loose hinge on the cold storage door and a gap at the base of the exterior wall that had been letting in night air and the occasional determined insect. He did both early in the morning before the crew came for breakfast, and both times left without mentioning it. Hector, the quiet man at the middle of the table, started leaving small things at the cookhouse door. A bundle of dried grass that Eleanor recognized as the purple flowering herb from the garden cut and tied with kitchen twine. 2 eggs larger than the ones from the cold storage from a hen he apparently kept somewhere on the property that nobody had mentioned to her. Once a small jar of something amber-colored that turned out to be wild honey, local, darker and stronger than anything from a kept hive. She used every bit of it. Tommy had started appearing at the cookhouse at odd hours under thin pretexts he needed to know what time supper was. He was passing by. He had a question about whether she'd seen a wrench, and Eleanor understood that what he actually needed was to be somewhere that felt like a home, so she let him come and gave him something to do when he was there. Small tasks, nothing demanding the kind of work that lets a person feel useful without having to be capable. On Thursday evening, she made the honey cake again. She made 3 of them, which was more than she needed, and she didn't examine too closely why she did that. She was pulling the last one from the oven when she heard the horses. Multiple horses coming fast from the south road. Not the easy pace of men returning from a day's work. Faster. Harder. She set the cake tin on the rack and went to the door. Caleb was already in the yard. He'd heard it too. He stood at the center of the yard with his attention fixed on the south gate, and 2 of the hands had come out of the barn, and Del Pruitt was moving from the bunkhouse direction with his belt not yet buckled, which told Eleanor he'd been inside when the sound reached him. 3 riders came through the gate. She didn't recognize the first 2 older men work-dressed the look of men who'd been riding hard for reasons they didn't enjoy. The third was younger, maybe 30, and he was the one doing the talking before his horse had fully stopped. "Morgan," he said, "we've got a problem." His name was Cole Rafferty. He ran a smaller operation 2 miles east shared fence line with Morgan Mountain on the lower pasture. Eleanor knew him by name from things she'd overheard a decent man Caleb's assessment, which meant considerable. The South Creek, Rafferty said, dropping from his horse. Something's wrong with it. My cattle won't go near it. I rode the line and found the inlet's been altered. Someone dug a diversion channel upstream up near the tree line. I don't know when. The water's still moving, but there's something in it. He looked at Caleb directly. Your south pasture runs off the same source. Caleb didn't react with the alarm that some men would have. He went still in the way he went still when he was thinking fastest. How far up? 1.5 miles, maybe 2. Up past the ridge where the old mining track runs. The old mining track. Eleanor filed that away. When did you notice? Caleb said. This morning, but it could have been happening for days. I don't know. Rafferty took his hat off, ran a hand over his head, put it back. Morgan, if that water's contaminated, we've got maybe 2 weeks before the cattle start showing symptoms, and if it's been going on longer... He stopped. The sentence didn't need finishing. Caleb turned to Del Pruitt. Get 6 men. We ride up at first light. I'll go tonight, Del said immediately. You'll go at first light, Caleb said, because I need you rested and thinking right, not up a dark mountain on tired horses making mistakes. He turned back to Rafferty. You'll stay. We'll feed you and your men and ride up together at dawn. Rafferty looked like a man who wanted to argue and recognized the argument was wrong. He nodded. Caleb looked at Eleanor across the yard. She was still in the cookhouse doorway. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. She went back inside and started cooking. She fed 7 extra men that night, and she did it without making anyone feel like an imposition, which was its own kind of skill. She put out everything substantial. She had the braised beef she'd been saving for Friday, the last of the cornbread, a pot of beans she hadn't planned to use until next week, and all 3 honey cakes, which had not been intended for tonight, but were necessary now because frightened men with a long night ahead of them needed something that tasted like the world was still manageable. The table that night was different from every other table she'd set in her 3 weeks on the mountain. The men were quieter. Not the hostile quiet of the first night, and not the settled, comfortable quiet she'd worked hard to build. This was a thinking quiet, a worried quiet. The quiet of men who understood that the thing they were afraid of was real. She refilled coffee, and she listened, and what she heard in pieces and fragments assembled itself in her mind, the way things assembled themselves when you paid attention long enough. The South Creek fed both the Morgan Mountain South pasture and Rafferty's lower range. If the water source had been diverted or contaminated, the cattle on both properties were at risk. Sick cattle in late summer meant losses going into fall. Losses going into fall meant a hard winter. A hard winter on top of 3 years of Holt's slow pressure meant that some men would make calculations they hadn't been willing to make yet. She thought about Gareth Lyle, sitting at this same table 2 weeks ago, eating her food with that assessing expression. She thought about 3 cooks in 3 months. She thought about what Caleb had said. He doesn't just offer money. He takes things. She waited until the table had cleared and the extra men had been shown to the bunkhouse overflow space and Rafferty had been given a room in the main house. She waited until the yard was quiet and the night had settled in. Then she went to find Caleb. He was at the porch of the main house, standing with one shoulder against the post, looking south. She came up and stood beside him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "It's Holt," she said. He didn't deny it. "Probably." "The water diversion, that's not something a man does casually," she said. "That's planning. That's knowing the land well enough to know what it will do if you change it." "Yes," he said. "How long has he known this property?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "He made his first offer 4 years ago," he said. "A year after Clara died." She absorbed that. "He's been watching for 4 years." "He's been patient for 4 years," Caleb said. "Which is not the same as watching." "What's the difference?" "Watching is passive," he said. "Patient means he's been building toward something. And I think he's decided this is when." She turned that over. "Because of the buyer," she said suddenly. Rafferty mentioned a cattle buyer. Someone was coming. "Harper and Donovan," Caleb said. "Largest purchaser in the territory. They're making their circuit in 3 weeks. They'll look at every substantial operation between here and the valley. They want volume and quality." He looked at her. If Morgan Mountain's cattle are sick, or if the herd looks compromised, we won't get the contract. And if we don't get the contract this year... He stopped. You lose the ranch, she said. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. She stood beside him in the dark and felt the weight of it. Not her weight, his, but near enough that she could feel its shape. 3 years of pressure. 4 years of Holt being patient. A wife who died and left recipes under stones. A mountain operation built by hand being taken apart, piece by piece, by a man who didn't need to hurry because he knew the math would eventually do his work for him. The creek can be fixed, she said, if we get up there in time. And the cattle, we don't know yet. What do you need for the Harper and Donovan meeting? He looked at her. A healthy herd, he said. That's the primary thing. But they look at the whole operation. They want to know the people running a ranch are people worth doing long business with. Then let me handle the meal, she said. He was quiet. When they come, she said. Let me put on a supper, not a showpiece, I don't mean that, but something that tells them what this place is. Something that says this ranch is run by people who take care of things and take care of each other. She paused. Because that's what's true, Caleb. That's what I've seen every day since I got here. And if those men can see it, they'll want to be in business with it. He looked at her for a long time. In the dark, she couldn't read his expression exactly, but she could feel the quality of his attention, which was the kind that took things in all the way down. 3 weeks, he said finally. I know, she said. I'll be ready. He nodded once. Then he looked back south again toward the dark ridge where the water source was, where in the morning he would ride with Del Pruitt and Six Hands and Cole Rafferty to find out what Holt's man had done and what could be salvaged. Go get some sleep, he said. It was gentle. Gentler than his usual register. You too, she said. She walked back to the cookhouse. She didn't sleep for 2 hours. She sat at the prep table with her grandmother's recipe book and her own notebook, which she'd been filling since her second week at Morgan Mountain, with the specifics of what she had and what she could get and what the garden would give her. She planned. She made lists, crossed things out, rewrote them. She thought about the meal the way she thought about all meals, starting from what the moment needed and working backward to what she could build. At some point, she must have laid her head down on the prep table, because the next thing she was aware of was the sound of horses in the yard and the eastern light through the cookhouse window, and the fact that Caleb and the men were leaving while she'd been asleep over her notebook. She was on her feet and at the door before she was fully awake. Caleb was mounted. 7 men with him, plus Rafferty and his 2. They were moving toward the south gate with the efficient quiet of people who know where they're going. He saw her in the doorway. He touched the brim of his hat. That was all. The small gesture of a man who doesn't traffic in speeches, for whom the action itself is the whole of what needs to be said. She watched them go. Then she started breakfast for the men who remained. They came back mid-afternoon. She knew something had happened before she could read anyone's face, because the horses came in at a different pace than they'd left, not hard and urgent, but heavy. The pace of people carrying a weight that isn't physical. Caleb dismounted in the yard, and for a moment just stood with both hands on the saddle. Then he straightened, said something short to Del, and came toward the cookhouse. Eleanor poured coffee before he reached the door. He came in and sat down the first time she'd seen him sit in the cookhouse, rather than stand at the prep table, and took the coffee with both hands. She waited. The diversion channel is real, he said. Someone dug it off the main creek bed, rerouted the flow through an old mineral seep. The water's not poison, but it's carrying sulfur from the rock. Not enough to kill cattle outright. Enough to make them go off their feed and lose condition. He paused. We estimate it's been running for 6 days. 6 days. She calculated fast. The cattle that have been drinking from it will be visibly affected by the time the buyers come, he said. Yes. Can you reroute it back? We filled the diversion channel. The water's running clean again. But the cattle that drank it, she said, will take time to recover. He looked at his coffee. Time we don't have. She sat down across from him. How bad? The south herd, he said. 38 head that have been on the south pasture. They'll look poorly. To a buyer who knows cattle, they'll know what a compromised animal looks like. He set the coffee down. Harper and Donovan have been buying cattle for 20 years. They know. She held his gaze. Then we don't hide it. He looked at her. If you try to hide it, and they find out, and they will find out, because men who've been buying cattle for 20 years will look at those animals and know something happened. Then you've lost not just the contract, but the relationship. She said it steadily, directly, the way she said things when she was certain. But if you show them, and you show them, you identified the problem, fixed it, and you can explain the recovery timeline, then they're seeing a man who manages his ranch and doesn't lie to his buyers. Caleb was very still. The meal won't change the cattle's condition, she said, but it might change how they see the man running the cattle. And in business, that matters as much. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Where did you learn to think like that?" "From running a business," she said, "and from losing one." Something in his face moved recognition, and something warmer underneath it. "There's something else," he said. She waited. "When we rode the ridge," he said, "above the diversion channel we found a marker, a survey marker, new, not more than a month old." He looked at her. "Holt isn't just trying to pressure me into selling. He's already staked a claim to part of the upper ridge. He's asserting that the eastern boundary of my property is in a different place than it is." "Is it a legal claim?" she said immediately. "I don't know," he said. "I need a lawyer to look at the original land grant, which is in Billings." "Then send for one," she said. "It takes time." "Then start today," she said. "Send Tommy on the fast horse to Billings tonight. Have him carry the land grant documents. Get a lawyer up here before the buyers arrive." She stopped. "Do you have the original documents?" "In the main house," he said. "Clara insisted we keep them there in the fireproof box." He looked at her again. She insisted. A pause settled between them, soft-edged. "She sounds like a woman who thought ahead," Eleanor said. "She was," he said simply. She stood up. She needed to move, to do something with her hands. She went to the stove and started the supper fire, not because she needed to fight yet, but because having a task grounded her. "Send Tommy tonight," she said. "Get the lawyer. Fix what can be fixed legally. And in 3 weeks, when those buyers sit at this table, they're going to see a ranch that doesn't run from trouble, that faces it and keeps working." She heard him stand up behind her. "Eleanor," he said. She turned. Howe was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the measuring look. Not the careful, weighted consideration. Something more open than that. Something that cost more. "I don't know what this place would look like right now if you hadn't come," he said. She felt the words land in her chest with more weight than she was ready for. She held his gaze. "You'd be managing," she said. "Maybe," he said. "But it wouldn't smell like peach pie." She laughed. It came out before she could decide whether to let it, a real laugh, startled and warm, and it seemed to surprise him too, because something in his expression broke open slightly, like a window letting in light. Then his face went still again, but not with the old closed stillness, with something thoughtful. "I'll send Tommy tonight," he said. He went out. He went out. Eleanor stood at the stove for a moment, with her hand on the pot, feeling the warmth of the iron and the weight of the last 20 minutes. Then she got back to work. Tommy left for Billings at 7 o'clock with the land grant documents in a saddlebag and instructions to ride careful, but ride fast. Eleanor watched him go from the cookhouse door, with a feeling she recognized as the functional cousin of fear, not panic, but the alert, clear-eyed state that comes when things have gotten serious enough to require your full attention. In the morning, the full weight of what Holt had done settled over the ranch like weather. It was Del Pruitt who said it out loud at the breakfast table, in the direct way he'd started to have now that the first walls were down. "Holt's not just buying," he said to no one in particular, his eyes on his plate. "He's breaking things." Nobody disagreed. "He breaks enough," said Hector, who almost never volunteered a sentence. "And he doesn't need to buy. We leave on our own." That quiet fell over the table again. The hard kind. Eleanor came out of the cookhouse with the second pot of coffee, and she walked the whole length of the table refilling cups. And as she walked, she said conversationally, like she was talking about the weather, "I've been thinking about what we're going to feed the Harper and Donovan men when they come." Several heads turned. "I'm going to need some things from the upper garden," she said. "Some of you have been up there, you know it better than I do. I'd like someone to show me the rest of it this week." Tommy was gone, but the red-haired boy's replacement at the end of the table, a young hand named Garrett, raised his chin. "I know where the apple trees are," he said. "Up past the west fence." "Good," she said. "I'll need those." Del Pruitt said, "What are you planning to make?" She looked at him. "The best meal anyone in this territory has ever had," she said simply. "Which means I need good ingredients. Which means I need your help getting them." Del looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his coffee cup. "All right," he said. "After the morning ride." And just like that, the table changed. Not back to fear, but forward into something else. A shared purpose, small and specific. The kind that men can grab hold of when the bigger things feel too large. She went back inside. 5 days before the buyers were due, Tommy came back from Billings. He rode in at noon dusty and tired, and he had 2 things with him. A lawyer named Harrington, who wore a city coat and looked at the mountain with the expression of a man who had made a professional decision he was personally uncertain about, and a message. Eleanor was at the cookhouse when they arrived. She heard Caleb's voice, sharp, more clipped than usual, and then a silence, and then the sound of Caleb walking fast toward the main house. She'd heard that walk twice before. Both times, something had been badly wrong. She waited. 20 minutes later, Caleb came to the cookhouse. He stood in the door without coming in. "Holt filed a formal boundary dispute with the Territorial Land Office," he said. 3 weeks ago, before the buyers were announced. He knew the circuit date before I did." Eleanor set down what she was holding. "Harrington says we have a case," Caleb said. "The original grant is clear, but a formal dispute takes time, and Holt knows that." His jaw was tight. "He's not trying to win in court. He's trying to make the ranch look like a legal mess when the buyers arrive. Disputed land, compromised water, compromised cattle." She looked at him steadily. "Can Harrington give you a letter? A legal opinion in writing that the claim is invalid?" Caleb frowned. "What good? If you can show the buyers a written legal opinion that the boundary dispute is frivolous before they set foot on this property," she said. "Then it's not a cloud over the ranch. It's a nuisance someone else is creating. That's a very different story." He stared at her. "You want me to get ahead of it?" "I want you to tell your story first," she said. "Every time." He turned and went back to the main house to talk to Harrington. Eleanor picked up what she'd set down and went back to work. Bad. She barely slept in the 5 days before the buyers came. She wasn't anxious in the way she'd have expected. She was focused, which felt different. She made list after list, adjusted, recalculated. She went up to the garden with Del Pruitt and Garrett and Hector and found things she hadn't known to look for: a row of dried herbs against the upper fence that turned out to be something she'd only ever read about: a wild celery root that the mountain soil had made denser and sweeter than anything cultivated, small firm apples from the trees. Garrett had found tart enough to need sugar and perfect for a tart that would hold its shape on a table that needed to look like a place of abundance. She made the raspberry preserves in large quantities and lined them on the cookhouse shelf because having them there visible and ready made the kitchen look like what it was: a working kitchen in a productive place, not a struggling operation, barely holding on. She roasted and jarred wild herbs. She rendered fat and made pastry. She baked bread twice so there would be some that was fresh and some that was a day old and sliceable. On the evening before the buyers arrived, Caleb came to the cookhouse late. The yard was quiet. She was still at the prep table going over her final list, and she had a slight headache from the lamp and probably from not eating enough that day, though she'd fed everyone else well. He saw her face when he came in. Without a word, he went to the bread shelf, cut 2 slices from the day-old loaf, spread them with the raspberry preserve, and set 1 plate in front of her. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. He sat down across from her with his own plate. "Eat," he said. She ate. He ate. They sat together in the lamplight in the cookhouse that smelled of everything she'd been building toward for 3 weeks, and neither of them said anything for a while. "Harrington thinks the legal opinion will hold," he said eventually. "Good. The South cattle are recovering, slower than I'd like but visibly better." "Better is enough," she said. I was quiet again. Then, "Whatever happens tomorrow." "Don't," she said. He stopped. "Don't finish that sentence," she said. "Not tonight. Whatever happens tomorrow, happens tomorrow. Tonight, finish your bread." He looked at her, and then full real unhurried he smiled. Not the shadow of one, not the almost one. The actual thing which changed his face entirely, made him look younger and less armored and entirely himself. She felt it in her chest like a struck chord. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and picked up his bread. The buyers arrived at 10 o'clock the next morning. 2 men. James Harper, 60-ish, silver-haired, the kind of lean that came from a lifetime of writing and not sitting at desks. Robert Donovan younger, maybe 50 stockier, watchful in the quiet way of a man who had made a great deal of money by seeing things other people missed. Caleb met them at the gate. Eleanor watched from the cookhouse door as he shook hands, not effusive, not anxious, just present and level, the way he was present and level about everything. She saw him talking. Couldn't hear it. But she saw Harper nod at something, and she saw Donovan look around the yard with that watchful expression taking inventory. She went back inside. She had a meal to finish. She had planned every dish the way she planned everything from the center outward. The center of this meal was the mountain itself. Every ingredient she could source from this property, from this garden, from this altitude, from the particular quality of what this place produced when someone took care of it. The dried herbs and wild honey. The apples from the west fence trees. The preserves. The celery root. And the beef, 2 of the best cuts from the Morgan Mountain herd, ranged on this mountain water-fed and slow-grown, the kind of beef that tasted like where it came from. She wanted Harper and Donovan to taste this ranch. She wanted them to understand in the way that food communicates things that words can't always reach, that Morgan Mountain was not a place in distress. It was a place with deep roots and honest labor, and the particular kind of richness that came from people who cared about what they were doing. She heard them on the porch at noon. Caleb's voice and Harper's asking questions. Donovan saying little which she'd expected. She carried the first course out herself. The yard had been tidied, not dressed up, not prettified, just cleared of the clutter that accumulated in working spaces and never got addressed unless there was a reason. Del Pruitt had done it yesterday morning without being asked. Hector had repaired a loose board on the long trestle table. Garrett had brought 2 extra chairs from the bunkhouse and set them at the head of the table without being told. 25 men, plus 2 buyers, plus Caleb, plus Cole Rafferty, who'd ridden over to eat with them, and whose presence said something about the kind of neighbor Caleb Morgan was. She set the food on the table, and she stepped back. What happened next was quiet. Not the hostile quiet of the first night, not the worried quiet of the boundary dispute conversation. The quiet that falls when something is so good that competing with it seems pointless. Harper took a bite of the beef. He set his fork down. He looked up not at Caleb, but at the mountain line above the ranch. "Where does this come from?" he said. "Morgan Mountain," Caleb said. Harper picked up his fork again. He didn't say anything else for a while. Donovan, halfway through his plate, looked at the table. At the men eating. At the jars of preserve that Eleanor had set out with the bread. At the apple tart, at the center of the table, golden-crusted fragrant. He looked at Caleb. "How long has she been cooking here?" he said. "A month," Caleb said. Donovan nodded slowly, like a man who had expected one answer and received another. "A month," he said. "And before that?" 3 weeks with no cook," Caleb said evenly. "And 3 cooks who didn't stay. The ones who left weren't failures. They were recruited away or driven off." He met Donovan's eyes directly. "I believe by agents of a competitor who wanted this operation weakened before this meeting." The table went very quiet. Caleb laid a paper on the table. "Harrington's legal opinion. I also want you to be aware of a boundary dispute that was filed against this property 3 weeks ago. My attorney's opinion is that it is entirely without legal merit. I want you to know about it, and I want you to know why I'm telling you about it before you ask." He paused. "I don't do business by hiding things." Harper and Donovan looked at each other. Then Harper looked down the long table at the 25 men eating in the particular settled way of men who trusted where they were. At Del Pruitt, who was eating his third piece of bread. At Hector, who was eating slowly with the focused appreciation of a man who had decided something was worth his full attention. Harper looked at Caleb. "The South Water issue," he said. "The cattle that were affected, what's the recovery timeline?" 2 to 3 weeks for full condition, Caleb said. "I can show you today's state and let you assess." Harper nodded. He looked at Donovan again. Donovan made a small gesture, almost nothing, just the slight lift of his chin. Harper looked back at Caleb. "We'll take the full herd," he said. "At the standard rate for the grade adjusted for the South cattle's current condition with a renegotiation clause when they've recovered." Caleb was still. "That's fair," he said. "It's also—" Harper picked up his fork and looked at the beef again. "The best meal I've had since my wife was alive." He ate. The table ate. Eleanor, standing in the cookhouse doorway, let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Del Pruitt caught her eye from down the table. He lifted his coffee cup just slightly toward her. She nodded once. She went back inside. She stood in the middle of the cookhouse with her hands at her sides, and the smell of everything she'd made filling the air around her, and she let herself feel it. Not triumph, not pride. Exactly something quieter and more real than either. She'd done the thing. Not alone. Not without the men who'd fixed the shelves and found the apple trees and brought eggs and honey to her door. Not without Caleb, who'd sent for a lawyer and told the truth at the table when lying would have been easier. But she had put the meal on the table, and the meal had done what meals do when they are made right. It had told the truth about the place that made it. She reached for the dish brush and started cleaning up. Outside, she could hear the sound of the table conversations beginning to move again. The lightened sound of men who had been under pressure and felt at ease. She heard Harper say something she couldn't make out, and Caleb's low response. She heard Del Pruitt laugh at something, the full laugh, the real one that she'd only heard from him twice in a month. And she heard underneath all of it, the particular sound of a ranch that had come back from the edge of something and was still standing. She washed every dish. She put every pot in its place. Then she untied her apron, folded it over the prep table, and stepped outside to feel the afternoon sun on her face. Caleb was standing at the edge of the yard watching Harper and Donovan ride toward the south pasture for the cattle review, Rafferty beside them. He stood the way he always stood, unhurried, solid, present. He heard her step behind him and turned. He looked at her for a long moment. And then he said quietly, like he was saying something that had been true for a while and had only just found the moment to be spoken, "Eleanor." Just her name, nothing more. But the way he said it, like it was the whole of what he'd been thinking about all month, distilled into one word, said everything. She held his gaze and didn't look away. The contract was signed on a Friday morning. Harper and Donovan stayed 2 nights at Morgan Mountain, which nobody had expected. They'd come for a day's review, and they'd stayed for the food. Though Eleanor didn't learn that until later, when Tommy reported with the particular pride of someone who'd contributed to a victory by association that he'd heard Harper tell Donovan over breakfast that he hadn't slept that well in 6 months, and he attributed it to the mountain air and whatever she'd put in that apple tart. The signing happened at the main house. Eleanor wasn't there. She was in the cookhouse making breakfast for 25 men who had collectively decided without discussion to be on their best behavior that morning. Del Pruitt had told 2 of the younger hands to keep their voices down before she'd even rung the bell, which she suspected was as close as Del would ever come to acknowledging that what happened in this cookhouse mattered to how the ranch presented itself. When Caleb came back across the yard with the signed papers in his hand, he didn't make an announcement. He walked to the cookhouse door, and he held the papers up slightly, just briefly, the way you'd acknowledge something without turning it into a speech. Del Pruitt saw it first. He said nothing. He just nodded once, the slow, deep nod of a man who has been worried for a long time and has just been told he can stop. The rest of the men caught it by ripple, a shift in posture down the table, shoulders dropping a 1/4 inch. The sound of the room changing in the way, Rooms change when something that had been held in suspension finally lands. Tommy said, "We got it," loud enough that several men told him to quiet down. "We got it," Caleb said. The breakfast table that morning was the best one Eleanor had put out in a month. Not the most elaborate, she'd cooked more complex meals in the days before the buyers arrived. But the best? The way a simple thing is best when it's made at the right moment. Eggs and biscuits, and the last of the honey cake, and strong coffee, and the raspberry preserve in 2 jars that she'd been saving without letting herself examine why. She watched from the cookhouse doorway while the men ate, and she let herself have the feeling for a moment, the good, solid, real feeling of something having worked. She didn't reach for words for it. She just held it the way you hold something warm between your hands. Harper stopped at the cookhouse door on his way to his horse. He was a man of few unnecessary words, which she'd come to respect in their 2 days of proximity. He said, "Miss Hayes, whatever Morgan's paying you, he ought to double it." Then he put his hat on and walked to his horse. Robert Donovan was behind him. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her directly with that watchful assessment that she'd noticed at the table 2 days ago. "My wife," he said, "used to make a honey cake on the first Sunday of every month." He paused. "She's been gone 11 years. Eleanor looked at him. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be," he said. "I'm not telling you that for sympathy. I'm telling you because I want you to know that I understand what you put on that table. Not everyone does." He nodded once, not a bow, just an acknowledgement. Good cooking and an honest operation. Those are 2 things that are harder to find than they ought to be. He went to his horse. Eleanor stood in the cookhouse doorway and watched Harper and Donovan ride south, and she thought about what Donovan had said, and she thought about Clara's recipe under the stone, and she thought about the way certain things persist in the world long after the people who made them are gone, continuing to do their work, reaching people they were never meant to reach. Then she went back inside and started the lunch fire. The afternoon. After the buyers left, something shifted between Caleb and Eleanor, and neither of them spoke about it directly, which was itself a kind of shift. He came to the cookhouse at 2 o'clock the middle of the afternoon, which was not his usual time. She was doing an inventory of the cold storage, making notes on what needed restocking before the first cold weather came. She heard him at the door and turned. He looked like a man who had something to say and was still deciding how. She waited. "Harrington says the boundary dispute will be dismissed within the month," he said. "The original grant documentation is clear. Holt's survey marker was placed on land that's been mined for 14 years. "Good," she said. "He also said—" Caleb stopped. He was holding his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim, which she'd learned was the thing he did when he was working through something difficult. "He said Holt is likely to make one more move before he accepts that this isn't going to go his way." "What kind of move?" "He doesn't know," Caleb said. "Neither do I. But Holt's pattern is to try everything he can think of before he walks away, and he hasn't tried everything yet." She looked at him steadily. "Are you warning me?" "I'm telling you what I know," he said. "I think you should know it." "All right," she said. "Then I know it." He nodded. He kept turning his hat. He didn't leave. She turned back to her inventory. Let him have the time. After a moment he said, "When Harper said to double your pay." She kept writing her list. "Yes." "He was right," Caleb said. She looked up. He met her eyes directly. "What you've done here the last month, I want you to know, I see it. Not just what happened with the buyers, all of it, the way the men are." He paused, looking for the words with the care of a man who doesn't use them carelessly. "I didn't realize how much the absence of it cost until it was here." She set her pencil down. "The absence of what?" Howe was quiet for a moment. "Someone taking care of things," he said. "Not just the cooking. The way you paid attention. To Tommy. To what Dell needed. To what the garden was. To what this place could be instead of just what it was." He looked at his hat. "Clara did that. I didn't understand until she was gone how much of what felt like the ranch was actually her." The cookhouse was very quiet. "You don't have to say that," Eleanor said carefully. "I know," he said. "I'm saying it because it's true, and I've been short on saying true things to people lately." He looked up. "I don't want to keep being short on it with you." She held his gaze for a long moment. "Caleb," she said, and his name in her mouth landed differently now than it had the first time she'd used it, weighted with a month of knowing him. "What are you trying to say?" He set his hat down on the prep table, both hands free, the kind of gesture that said he wasn't looking for an exit. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "But I know I don't want you to think your position here is uncertain. Whatever else happens, I want you to know this ranch is a place you can stay." It was not a declaration. It was not a proposal. It was a man who had spent years building walls telling her carefully that the door he'd installed in one of them was unlocked. She understood it exactly for what it was. "Thank you," she said. "I'm not planning to leave." He picked his hat back up. Some of the tension went out of his shoulders. "Good," he said. He put his hat on. He went to the door. He stopped. "The apple tart," he said without turning. "From the buyer's supper." "Yes? Was there any left?" She almost smiled. "I put a piece in the cold storage for you," she said. "It's wrapped in cloth on the second shelf." A pause. "How long has it been there?" "Since the morning after," she said. "I was waiting to see if you'd ask." He turned then. The expression on his face was something between surprise and something that wasn't surprise at all, as if he'd been caught at the edge of something he'd been approaching for a long time without acknowledging it. "Good night, Eleanor," he said. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. "Good night, Caleb," she said. I went out, and she heard him pause just outside the door, and then his steps crossed the yard, and she stood in the cookhouse with the inventory list in her hand, and the particular stillness of a woman who was very carefully not letting herself think too fast. Holt's last move came on a Wednesday, 8 days after the contract was signed. It did not come in the form Eleanor expected. She was in the garden in the early morning, assessing what the first hint of coming autumn was doing to the late-season plants when Tommy appeared at the garden gate, with the expression he wore when something had happened that he didn't know how to rank. "There's a woman at the gate," he said. Eleanor straightened. "What kind of woman?" "City woman," Tommy said. "Dressed well. She asked for Mr. Morgan, but he's up the ridge doing the fence line check. She said she'd wait." He paused. "She said she knew him. From before." Eleanor came out of the garden. The woman was standing near the gate, with the stillness of someone accustomed to waiting in comfort and finding other conditions merely inconvenient. She was perhaps 45, handsome in the angular way of a woman who had made choices about what to keep and what to let go, dressed in a traveling suit that had come from somewhere east of Billings and probably east of Denver. She looked at Eleanor with the particular assessment that one competent woman gives another when she isn't certain of the category. "I'm Eleanor Hayes," Eleanor said. "I cook for this ranch. Mr. Morgan is working the upper fence line this morning. Can I help you?" "Margaret Holt," the woman said. Eleanor heard the name and went very still inside where it didn't show. "Preston Holt's wife," she said. "His sister," Margaret said. And something in her expression moved, not apology, not warmth, but a kind of precision that indicated she was being careful about the distinction. "Come in," Eleanor said. "I'll get you coffee." She brought Margaret Holt into the cookhouse rather than the main house, which was a decision she made in half a second and didn't examine until later. The cookhouse was her ground. She understood everything that happened in it. Margaret sat at the prep table and accepted the coffee and looked around the cookhouse with the attention of someone reading a room. "This is not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" Eleanor said. "My brother described a struggling ranch," Margaret said. "On the edge of failure. Understaffed, underfed, running on reputation it no longer deserved." And this is a working kitchen," Margaret said. "That garden I passed is being worked. The men I saw in the yard are moving like people with a purpose." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "My brother is not always right about things." Eleanor said nothing. "He's going to tell you I'm here to negotiate," Margaret said. "He doesn't know I'm here. He'll probably assume that's why I came when he finds out." She looked at Eleanor directly. "That's not why I came." Eleanor waited. Caleb Morgan and my brother were friends, Margaret said. 20 years ago, before the ranches, before the money, before Preston decided that the most important thing a man could do was own more land than the man next to him. She paused. Preston did something to this ranch that crossed a line I can't stand behind, the water diversion. I found out about it 2 weeks ago, and I've been trying to decide what to do since. You came to tell him yourself, Eleanor said. I came to tell someone, Margaret said. I wasn't sure who, but I thought if I tell Caleb directly, it looks like a negotiation, a gesture to soften his position. She looked at Eleanor. I thought maybe if I told the woman who runs the kitchen, it would just be the truth. Eleanor held her gaze steadily. What truth? Margaret set her coffee down. Preston hired a man named Colton to divert that creek. Colton is also the one who placed the survey marker on the ridge. And Colton. She paused with the pause of someone selecting their words with precision. Colton has documentation of Preston's instructions, written, because Colton is careful about protecting himself, which is a quality my brother failed to account for. The cookhouse was absolutely silent. Where is that documentation? Eleanor said, not quite a question. In Colton's possession, Margaret said. He'll produce it for the right request, and the right request would come from a lawyer with standing to receive it. She looked at her coffee cup. I believe Mr. Morgan has a lawyer named Harrington currently reviewing his land grant. Eleanor stood up slowly. Why are you doing this? She said. He's your brother. Margaret was quiet for a moment. My husband died 4 years ago, she said. He left me this ranch, she corrected herself. He left me a modest property outside of Livingston. It's not large. Preston has been suggesting for 2 years that I sell it to him and come live in his house where I'd be comfortable and cared for, and entirely without my own judgment. She looked at Eleanor, and in that look was something Eleanor recognized in her own history. The look of a woman who has been told in various ways and various languages that her independence is a problem to be solved. I'm not interested in being managed, she said. And I'm not interested in watching my brother manage other people out of what they've built. Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. Then she went to the cookhouse door. Tommy, she called. Tommy appeared so fast, she suspected he'd been nearby. Yes, ma'am. Go up to the ridge fence line and get Mr. Morgan, she said. Tell him he needs to come back. Tell him it matters. Tommy went at a run. Eleanor came back inside. She cut 2 pieces from the bread on the shelf and put the raspberry preserve between them, and set 1 plate in front of Margaret Holt, and kept 1 for herself, and sat down across from the woman at her own prep table. Tell me everything you know, she said. Caleb came back from the ridge in under 30 minutes. He came into the cookhouse and saw Margaret, and went completely still, in the way he went still, when something required him to recalibrate everything at once. Eleanor watched his face go through several things in fast succession: recognition, surprise, something careful that wasn't quite suspicion, the remnant of something old that might have been friendship before it got complicated. Margaret, he said. Caleb. She stood. I know what Preston did. I'm here to help you stop him. He looked at Eleanor. She gave him the smallest nod. He pulled out the chair across from Margaret and sat down. Eleanor put coffee in front of him. He listened, while Margaret told him what she'd told Eleanor, without interruption, his hands flat on the prep table, his expression giving away nothing. But Eleanor, who had been watching his face for a month and had learned its geography, the way you learn the topography of land you walk every day, saw what moved underneath it. Not the external thing. The internal pressure of a man who had been fighting alone for a long time, being told that what he'd been fighting was worse than he knew, and that he wasn't alone in knowing it. When Margaret finished, Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Why? He said to his coffee. Because it went too far, Margaret said simply. The pressure, the lawyers, those are business. The water was something else. He looked up at her. You know that if this comes out, it damages him significantly. I know, she said. He's your brother. He is, she said. He's also wrong. Another silence. Eleanor refilled coffee without being asked. I'll need to contact Harrington today, Caleb said. I'll write you a letter, Margaret said. Something you can give him with Colton's name and what he holds. The rest is between lawyers." Caleb nodded. He looked at Eleanor. "Can you give us an hour?" "Of course," she said. She went out to the garden, not because the garden needed her, but because she needed somewhere to put the feeling that was moving through her, which was large and not entirely comfortable, and had something to do with watching a man she respected, receive justice from an unexpected direction, and understand that he didn't have to carry the weight of fighting for it entirely alone. She pulled weeds for an hour. Not because there were many, because pulling weeds when your hands need work is one of the oldest forms of thinking. Margaret Holt stayed for lunch. She hadn't planned to, and Eleanor hadn't exactly planned to invite her, but the conversation in the cookhouse had run to midday, and it seemed unkind to put a woman on a horse without feeding her, and there was something Eleanor wanted to understand better about this particular woman that a shared meal would help with. The three of them ate at the end of the long trestle table. Margaret, Caleb, Eleanor, the rest of the crew having dispersed to the afternoon's work. Eleanor put out bread and cold chicken and the last of a bean soup she'd made that morning, and sliced apples with a little honey drizzled over them. Margaret looked at the food with an expression Eleanor had seen before. Not hunger, though she ate with appetite. Something more like recognition. "Preston told me the cook here couldn't last a week," Margaret said. "She was here a week before he even knew she was here," Caleb said without particular emphasis, like he was correcting a calculation. Margaret looked at Eleanor. "What made you stay?" she said. "Not the job. Most women would have been on the next wagon south after the first night." Eleanor considered the question honestly. "The garden," she said. "And the fact that the men who walked out came back." She paused. "Things that can come back are worth staying for." Margaret looked at her for a moment longer than the answer strictly required. Then she looked at Caleb. He was eating with the focused quiet he brought to most things, but Eleanor could see him listening to the conversation in the way he listened to things that mattered to him. "I'd like to see the garden before I go," Margaret said. "I'll show you," Eleanor said. They walked the garden together, while Caleb dealt with a fence issue. Del Pruitt brought to his attention. Eleanor suspected Del had manufactured the timing because Del had turned out to be quite deliberate about most things, despite his rough presentation. She and Margaret walked the upper beds and the raspberry canes and the wild herb section, and the path up to where the peach trees stood still, carrying the last of the summer's fruit. Margaret stopped at the peach trees. "Clara planted these," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Eleanor said. Margaret reached out and touched the branch of the nearest tree. "I knew her," she said. "Not well. Preston and Caleb were already rivals by the time I was paying attention, but I knew her. She paused. "She was the kind of person who left things better than she found them." "I know," Eleanor said. "I see it every day." Margaret turned and looked at her. "You found her recipe," she said. "Tommy mentioned it." "In a tin box under a stone," Eleanor said, "wrapped in oilcloth." "That is entirely her," Margaret said with something in her voice that was half grief and half warmth. She dropped her hand from the branch. "She'd be glad you found it," she said, "and glad of what you've done with this place." Eleanor felt something in her chest that she'd been feeling more often lately. Not grief, not exactly, but the particular feeling of being trusted with something that mattered to more people than just yourself. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for the bread," Margaret said dryly, and Eleanor laughed, and Margaret smiled, and they walked back down through the garden toward the sound of the ranch. Harrington left the following morning with Margaret's letter and Colton's name and enough information to put Preston Holt in a position from which his only viable exit was to drop the boundary dispute and walk away from Morgan Mountain permanently. Caleb told Eleanor about it that evening, as he'd started to tell her things standing in the cookhouse doorway, coffee in hand, the yard quieting down around them. "It's not finished," he said. "Harrington still needs to make contact. Holt still has options, but the worst of it is over," she said. "Yes," he said. "The worst of it is over." She nodded. She was washing the last of the supper dishes, and her hands kept moving while they talked, which was the most natural thing she'd found, that conversations went better when her hands were doing something. "Margaret is going to sell her property," Caleb said. Not to Preston, to herself. She's going to hire help and run it. He paused. She said you told her that things that can come back are worth staying for. Eleanor turned off the water. I said that about this ranch. She took it personally, he said. There was something in his voice that was not quite amusement, but lived in the same neighborhood. She dried her hands. She turned around. I was looking at her with the expression she'd first seen as weighing, and had learned was something more complex than that, the expression of a man who was perpetually taking stock of something he cared about, which was, she'd understood for some time now, his way of paying attention to the things that mattered most to him. I need to tell you something, he said. She waited. When the agency and billing sent your name, he said slowly, I told them I needed someone who could handle a rough posting. They said you were the only applicant who'd worked a posting rougher than this one, and that you'd left your last position in good standing, despite circumstances that would have broken most people. He paused. I didn't know what to expect, but I didn't expect you. What did you expect? Someone who would manage, he said. Get through the first hard weeks and find a working routine and be a decent cook who the men tolerated. He looked at his coffee. I didn't expect someone who would... He stopped. Who would what? What, she said. He looked up. Make it feel like something worth keeping, he said. The cookhouse was very quiet. Eleanor stood with the dishcloth in her hands and looked at Caleb Morgan, who was holding a coffee cup and looking at her like a man who had said something real and was waiting to see what it cost him. Caleb, she said. I know, he said quickly. You work for this ranch. This isn't... Caleb, she said again more quietly. He stopped. I know what you're trying to say, she said. And I know what's stopping you from saying it. And I want to tell you something first. She set the dishcloth down. I came up this mountain because I had nothing left, not in Springfield, not in St. Joseph. I was starting from the ground up, and I knew it, and I was more frightened than I've told anyone since I got here. She held his gaze. And then I got here, and the ground was real, and the work was real, and the people were real. And I started to think that maybe what I lost wasn't the end of what I was building. Maybe it was just the end of the wrong version of it. I was very still. I'm not looking to leave, she said. I told you that weeks ago. But I want you to understand, it's not because the job is good, or the kitchen is good, or I have nowhere else to go. She paused. It's because this is where I want to be. Caleb set his coffee cup down on the prep table. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before in all the weeks she'd been studying his face open, completely. Open the wall, not lowered, but gone, as if it had never been there. And the only reason it had seemed like one was because it was the first thing you saw before you understood what was behind it. I don't know how to do this, he said. I haven't since Clara. I've been fine not knowing how to do it. You've been managing, she said. He looked at her. Yes, he said. I've been managing. Me too, she said. Until now. He moved. Not far, 2 steps, which covered most of the distance between them. And then he stopped as if he'd decided to let the last bit be her choice. She crossed the remaining distance. She'd thought in the abstract moments when she'd let herself think about it, that it might feel sudden crossing from one thing into another. It didn't. It felt like arriving somewhere she'd been walking toward for a month, and the arrival feeling quiet and certain and entirely inevitable. He put his arms around her, and she felt the solidity of him, the actual physical reality of a man who had spent years building something real. And she put her face against his shoulder for a moment, and just let herself be still. Eleanor, he said into her hair. I know, she said. They stood in the cookhouse with the lamp burning low and the smell of the day's cooking still in the air around them, and outside the mountain was dark, and the ranch was quiet, and the night birds were doing what they did. After a moment he said very quietly, I still have 2 more pieces of that apple tart. She laughed, muffled against his shoulder, but real. I know, she said. I put them there. You've been putting things aside for me since the 2nd week, he said. You never asked, she said. So I kept waiting. He was quiet. Then, I should have asked. Yes, she said. You should have. What followed was not simple because the things that are real are never simple, but they were good in the way that good things are when you've earned them. Harrington reached Colton the following week. Colton produced his documentation because Colton was indeed very careful about protecting himself, and the documentation was thorough in the way that careful men's documentation is. Preston Holt, faced with the choice between a public legal proceeding and a quiet withdrawal, withdrew. The boundary dispute was dropped within 10 days. The survey marker on the ridge was removed by men Holt sent, who did the job without speaking to anyone on the Morgan Mountain property and left before noon. Caleb said when it was done, "It's over." Just that. 2 words in the way he said things that were true and complete. Eleanor was in the garden when he told her, and she pressed her hand flat against the soil for a moment, feeling the warmth of the late summer earth, and said, "Good." The ranch breathed out. There was no announcement, no celebration. Del Pruitt fixed the east water pump a second time better than the first. Hector started showing Eleanor where the late-season root vegetables were hiding in the lower garden. Garrett brought her 3 more jars of wild honey from the mountain bees, which he'd apparently been collecting for weeks on his own initiative. Tommy came back from Billings with a letter for Eleanor that she read once and put in the cookhouse stove, which was her answer. Warren Shea did not write again. And in the evenings when the work was done and the yard was quiet, Caleb Morgan stopped being a man who stood in the doorway of the cookhouse and started being a man who came inside and sat down. They talked. Not about the ranch always, though the ranch was often present. About Clara, sometimes Caleb would bring her up in the way of a man who had learned that talking about someone he'd loved was not a betrayal of the person he was with, but a way of being honest about who he was. About Springfield, about the bakery, about the things Eleanor had learned from losing what she'd worked for, that she could not have learned any other way. About the garden and what it might be in the spring if she started planning now. About the honey cake, which she made a 3rd time, and about which Caleb said very little, but which he ate 2 full pieces of, while looking at the wall with an expression she'd learned to read as the expression of a man managing a feeling he hadn't expected to have. One evening he asked her if she missed Missouri. She thought about it honestly, the way he'd taught her to think about things by looking at what was actually true rather than what was easy to say. "I miss the person I was before the fire," she said. She believed things were going to work out. She paused. "But I think I believe that again now, so maybe I don't miss her as much as I thought." He looked at her for a long moment. "The person you were before the fire," he said. "What was she like?" "She was too trusting," Eleanor said. "And she thought that working hard was enough. That if you were good at what you did, and you showed up, and you put in the hours, that would protect you." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. She hadn't learned yet that the world doesn't owe you the thing you've earned. "And now I know it doesn't owe me anything," she said. "But I also know that what I build with my own hands is mine. And nobody can take that. They can take the building. They can't take what's in my hands." He was quiet for a long time. "Clara used to say something like that," he said finally. "She said the ranch wasn't the land. The ranch was what we did on it every day." He looked down. "After she died, I lost that. I kept the land. I worked the land. But for a long time I forgot that those weren't the same thing." Eleanor held his gaze. "You remembered," she said. "You didn't sell. You didn't leave. You kept working." "Barely," he said. "Barely is enough," she said. "Barely means you were still here when it mattered." He looked at her with that open expression she'd seen first the night he'd told her what she meant to this place, the expression that was the real one, the one underneath all the steadiness and the economy and the careful weighing of things. "I didn't know I was waiting," he said, "until you came." She didn't answer that with words. She put her hand on the table between them, not taking his, just placing it there. After a moment, he put his hand next to hers, not touching, just there, close enough. The night before. September found them on the porch of the main house, which was the first time Eleanor had been there with him rather than walking past it. The air had changed, still warm from the day, but with that particular coolness underneath it that came off the mountain after sundown. The first clear signal that summer was beginning to think about leaving. First cold night in 2 or 3 weeks, Caleb said. I know, she said. I've been thinking about what to do with the last of the garden before it turns. More preserves. More preserves, she said. And I want to try drying the herbs a different way. I've been reading about it in... She stopped. In what? He said. In Clara's recipe book, she said carefully. The front half the part in her handwriting. She had some notes in the margins about what she was trying. She'd been unsure how to say it, and now that she'd said it, she watched his face. He didn't go still in the painful way. He went still in the thoughtful way, which was different. What was she trying? He said. A lavender herb salt, Eleanor said. For the winter preserves. She'd written down the proportion she was going to use, but there's no note about whether she ever made it. He looked at the mountain. She got sick that fall, he said. She never made it to the winter preserves. A pause. I'd like to try to finish what she started, Eleanor said. If that's all right with you. He turned and looked at her. Something in his face moved through several things, and at the end of all of them was something Eleanor recognized as the particular kind of peace that comes when grief has been carried long enough that you can finally set it down somewhere safe. Yes, he said. I'd like that. She nodded. She looked out at the dark yard, the barn, the bunkhouse with the yellow light in the window where some of the men were still up. The cookhouse where the fire was banked and the preserves were lined on the shelf and the recipe book was on the prep table where she always kept it. Caleb, she said. Yes. I want to stay, she said. Not because of the job. He was very still beside her. I know what I want, she said. I've known for a while. I wasn't going to say it until you were ready. And I think you're ready. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the full kind, the kind that comes before something that can't be unsaid and doesn't need to be. I'm not easy to know, he said finally. I close up when things are hard. I don't always say things when I should. I don't... He stopped. I'm not going to be easier than I am. I know that, she said. I know exactly who you are. I've been watching you for a month. And, he said. She looked at him. And I'd rather have the real thing hard parts and all than anything simpler that isn't real. He turned toward her on the porch, and the expression on his face in that moment was the one she would remember. Not the weighing look, not the open look, not the almost smile. Something that combined all of those into the truest version of him. She'd seen a man who had carried loss and kept going, who had built something real and nearly lost it, who had spent years with his walls up and was choosing now tonight to put them down. Stay, he said, not as the cook. He reached out and touched her hand and then held it fully, his fingers over hers. Stay as... He looked for the word. As the person who stays, she said. He held her gaze. Yes, he said. That. She turned her hand in his and held on. Outside the mountain was dark, and the first hint of September was in the air, and somewhere in the barn a horse moved in its stall with the low sound of something comfortable and settled, and the ranch was quiet, in the best way a ranch can be. Quiet, not empty, not abandoned, but resting. The way things rest when they have done the work of the day and are trusted to still be there in the morning. Eleanor Hayes held the hand of the man beside her and looked out at the dark yard and felt for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember entirely at home. September came to Morgan Mountain the way it always came to high country, not gradually, not gently, but with the sudden authority of a season that knows its time has arrived and isn't interested in argument. Eleanor felt it the morning after she and Caleb had sat on the porch and she had told him she wanted to stay. She woke before the alarm she'd trained herself to the way she'd been waking every morning since Springfield, and she lay in the small room off the back of the cookhouse and listened to the mountain and understood that something had changed in the air. Not just the temperature, which had dropped enough overnight to make her pull the blanket up, but something else. A quality of light through the window. A stillness that had weight in it. She got up. She started the fire. She made coffee. By the time the coffee was ready, she'd understood what the feeling was. She was not afraid of what came next. In Springfield, every morning had carried a low-level dread she'd become so accustomed to that she'd stopped recognizing it as dread and started calling it preparation. Preparing for what might go wrong. Preparing for Warren to have made a decision without telling her. Preparing for the money to be shorter than the book said. After the fire, it had gotten worse. Not better every new morning. A kind of reckoning. A tallying of what she had versus what she needed, and the gap between them always wider than she wanted. This morning she stood at the cookhouse stove with her coffee, and she felt none of that. She felt the fire warming the room, and the coffee warming her hands, and the particular pleasure of a kitchen that was hers, in the way that places become yours when you've cleaned every corner of them, and cooked 10,000 meals in them, and learned where the light falls at every hour of the day. She was still standing there when the knock came at the cookhouse door. Not Caleb's knock, she knew his by now, 2 firm raps, no hesitation. This was lighter. She opened the door. Tommy stood on the step with his hat in his hands and his ears red, which on Tommy meant he was feeling something strongly and had not yet figured out how to manage it. "I wanted to ask you something," he said. "Come in," she said. He came in and stood at the prep table, in the way he always stood there, like a young man who'd decided to be somewhere and wasn't entirely sure what to do with his body once he arrived. She poured him coffee and waited. "My mother," he said. "She used to make biscuits on Sunday mornings, with honey. We didn't have much, but she always made sure there were biscuits on Sunday." He looked at his coffee. "I wrote her a letter last week. First one since I came up the mountain. I hadn't been writing because I didn't know what to say." He stopped. Eleanor waited. "I told her about the peach pie," he said. "I told her about the honey cake and the raspberry preserves and the way this cookhouse smells on a cold morning." He looked up. She wrote back. She said it sounded like a real home. He handed Eleanor a folded piece of paper, the letter she realized from his mother. She looked at him questioningly. "I thought you should read it," he said. She unfolded it. The handwriting was a mother's handwriting, the particular combination of care and speed that comes from someone who writes between other obligations. It said, among other things, "Tell the cook she's doing God's work, son. A woman who can make a rough place feel like a home is worth more than she'll ever be paid for it." Eleanor folded it back up and handed it to Tommy. She didn't say anything for a moment. She didn't trust what her voice would do. "Thank you for showing me," she said. He nodded, still red-eared. "I thought you should know," he said. He took his coffee and his hat and went back out to the morning. Eleanor stood in the cookhouse with the fire and the coffee and the feeling of Tommy's mother's words settling somewhere permanent inside her, and she thought, this is what it's for. This exactly, this. 2 days into September. Cole Rafferty rode over for what he said was a fence line question and was obviously something more, because Rafferty had the kind of face that didn't know how to hide when a fence line wasn't the real subject. Eleanor was in the garden when he arrived. She heard him in the yard with Caleb, their voices low and businesslike at first, and then shifting into something else, the lower register that men use when they're discussing things that matter. She came in from the garden an hour later to find Caleb at the prep table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, which meant he'd been sitting there thinking for a while. "Rafferty wants to put in a joint bid next season," he said without her asking. His range and mine together presented to Harper and Donovan as a combined supply. More volume, better rate. "Is that good?" she said, though she could already read the answer in how he was sitting. "It's very good," he said. "It's the kind of arrangement that secures this place for the next 5 years. He paused. "He said the buyers mentioned us specifically when they reached his property last week. Said Morgan Mountain was the kind of operation they wanted to do long business with." She went to the stove and reheated his coffee without comment. "He also said," Caleb continued, "that Harper told him the meal was the best he'd had on a circuit in 20 years. He looked at her. "Harper has been doing this circuit for 20 years. "I know," she said. She set the reheated coffee in front of him. "Drink that before it goes cold again." He almost smiled. He drank it. "There's something else," he said. She sat down. "Margaret Holt sent the letter," he said. "To me, not Harrington. She's moved forward on the Livingston property. She's hired 2 hands and she's keeping the cattle she has." He looked at the prep table. She said she told her brother about coming here, about talking to you." How did he respond? He told her she'd betrayed him, Caleb said. She told him she'd done what was right, and that he could have a sister who disagreed with him or no sister at all, and that the choice was his. Eleanor was quiet. She wants to know, Caleb said, if she can correspond with you. Eleanor looked at him. With me. With you. He looked at his coffee. She said you were the only person she'd met in years who talked to her like she was a person making her own decisions, instead of a problem someone else needed to solve. Eleanor thought about Margaret Holt standing in the garden with her hand on the branch of the peach tree, saying she'd be glad you found it. Thought about the look on Margaret's face when she'd eaten the bread and the raspberry preserve at the prep table. The look not of a guest being entertained, but of a woman sitting somewhere she hadn't expected to feel comfortable, and finding that she did. Yes, Eleanor said. Tell her yes. Caleb nodded. He finished his coffee. He got up, and as he passed the prep table, he did the thing he'd started doing in the last 2 days since the porch. He put his hand on her shoulder. Briefly, the gentle press of it. Not performance, it's just acknowledgement, the language of people who've decided they're in the same place. Then he went back out to the work. The first real cold came the following Tuesday, and it came hard. Eleanor woke to the sound of wind off the mountain and a temperature in the cookhouse that told her the banked fire had burned lower than she'd intended. She was at the stove before full waking, feeding wood getting heat back into the room, and by the time the fire was right, she could hear movement in the bunkhouse and the barn, the ranch responding to the cold, the way it responded to everything with immediate practical action. She had breakfast ready earlier than usual. The cold did, that made people move faster, made them want something hot, waiting when they came in from the morning work. The first man through the door was Del Pruitt, and the second was Hector, and by the time the full crew was at the table, the cookhouse was warm enough that some of them had taken their work coats off, which meant she'd done her job. Del Pruitt said over his second cup of coffee to no one specifically, and therefore to everyone, "First colds early this year." Several men agreed. "Means a hard winter," Hector said. "Or a short one," Garrett offered. "In my experience," Del said, wrapping both hands around his cup, "when the mountain wants to be hard, it's hard as long as it wants to be, and not 1 day shorter." Eleanor was at the stove and did not turn around, but she was smiling. "Well," Tommy said from his end of the table, "at least we've got a proper cook this year." The table was quiet for half a second, and then several men said variations of agreement overlapping and unorchestrated the way men agree to things when they're not trying to make a point, but simply stating what they know to be true. Eleanor pressed her lips together and kept her back to the room. Del Pruitt said, "Miss Hayes." She turned. "The cold storage roof," he said. "There's a section that's going to give trouble in heavy snow. I noticed it last week. I was going to mention it to Mr. Morgan, but I thought I'd ask you first since it's your storage." She looked at him. 3 months ago, this man had pushed his plate away from her table to make a point. Now he was asking her first about repairs to the building she worked in, because he'd decided it was her domain, and she deserved the first notice. "I'd appreciate it if you'd take a look," she said, "and tell me what you find." He nodded. He finished his coffee and stood up. "After the morning ride," he said. She nodded. The crew left for the day's work in the good-natured noise of men who had somewhere to be and enough coffee in them to get there. And Eleanor started the cleanup and thought about the cold storage roof and the winter ahead and the lavender herb salt she was still working on from Clara's notes, and she thought that this was a fine thing to have a winter's worth of work ahead of you in a place you wanted to be. The letter arrived on a Thursday, 10 days into September, and it changed everything. Eleanor was in the cookhouse when Tommy brought it in with the supply delivery, and she looked at the handwriting on the front and felt something shift in her chest before she'd even opened it. It was from the Territorial Land Office in Billings. She set it on the prep table and looked at it for a moment, then picked it up and opened it. It was addressed to both Caleb Morgan and Eleanor Hayes. She read it once fast, then again slow, and then she sat down on her stool because her legs had decided this was the moment to be uncertain. It was from a land attorney named Beaumont, who represented the Territory's Office of Unclaimed Property Claims. The letter stated that a historical search of the Morgan Mountain land, grant conducted in connection with the recent boundary dispute resolution, had surfaced a secondary document, a codicil to the original grant filed by the territory's founding administrator in 1871, that named a specific provision for the land adjacent to the eastern creek bed. The provision designated that land 11 acres as protected agricultural territory, which had a specific meaning under territorial law. It could not be purchased, disputed, absorbed, or claimed by any party except the current holder of the primary grant. The codicil had been buried in the filing records for 15 years, unknown to anyone including the original grantee. It meant that the land Holt had tried to claim was not only not his, it never could have been anyone's but Caleb Morgan's. But that wasn't the part that made Eleanor's legs uncertain. The codicil, Beaumont's letter explained, included a secondary provision added by the filing administrator, a note, handwritten, attached to the original document. The note stated that the protection was granted specifically because the land contained what the administrator described as a productive mountain garden of unusual quality, maintained by the grant holder's family, which represents a contribution to the territory's agricultural knowledge and should be preserved. 14 years ago, someone in the territorial office had looked at Clara Morgan's garden and decided it was worth protecting under law. Eleanor read that twice. Then she got up, took the letter, and walked to the main house to find Caleb. Howe was at his desk in the small room off the main hallway that served as his office. She'd only been in it twice, both times to deliver something and leave quickly. She knocked on the open door. He looked up. She held out the letter. He took it. He read it. He read it again. He was very still for a long time. "The garden," he said. "The garden," she said. He set the letter down flat on the desk. He looked at it. He looked up at her. "She never knew," he said. "Clara. She planted it and worked it, and she never knew someone had done this." "She knew it mattered," Eleanor said. "She left you a recipe in a tin box under a stone so you'd know where to find what she'd built." She paused. "That's a woman who knew her work would outlast her." He looked at the letter again, and this time the expression on his face was not grief and not surprise, and not the careful weighing look. It was something Eleanor had not seen before, a man being quietly deeply moved by something he hadn't known to expect, which is the most genuine form of being moved because it hasn't had time to be managed. He reached out and picked up the letter again. He read the administrator's handwritten note one more time. Then he folded it once and held it the way he'd held Clara's recipe, not setting it down, not putting it in his pocket, just holding it. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "I was going to sell," he said. 6 months ago, before you came, before the contract, before any of it, I had a number in my head. If Holt came with that number, I was going to take it." He looked at her steadily, with the honesty that cost him things. "Not because I wanted to sell, because I'd run out of reasons to keep fighting." Eleanor held his gaze. "What changed?" 40 peach pies," he said. "And a woman who went back to the kitchen when she had every reason to leave." She felt that land in her chest and stay there. "This is your ranch," she said. "It is," he said. "And I want you to understand what that means." He stood up. He was in the doorway of his office now, closed, the letter still in his hand. "It's not going to get easier, Eleanor. The mountain doesn't get gentler in October. The winters up here are real. The work is real. There will be years when the cattle don't bring what we need, and years when the weather takes things we can't afford to lose. I'm not offering you a comfortable life." "I know that," she said. "I'm offering you a real one," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Caleb," she said, "I burned my bakery down to the ground and rebuilt from a recipe book and a canvas bag." She paused. "I know what real costs. I'm not afraid of it." He reached out and took her hand, the way he'd taken it on the porch, fully, not tentatively, a man who had decided and was done with tentative. "I was going to wait until spring," he said. "I had it in my head that I'd wait until I was certain everything was stable. The contract settled, the boundary resolved, the winter accounted for." He looked at their hands. "I don't want to wait anymore." She understood what he was saying. She felt her heart beat twice steady and deliberate, and she understood that she'd known this was coming for long enough that she wasn't surprised by it, only by the feeling of it actually arriving, which was not what she'd expected. Nothing close to what she'd expected, because what she'd expected was something momentous, and this was something better than that. Something quiet and certain, and as solid as the mountain under the ranch. "Then don't," she said. He looked at her. "Stay," he said. "Not as the person who stays, as the person this is." It was not elegant. It was not rehearsed. It was a man who didn't traffic in speeches, finding the truest version of what he meant with the words he actually had. "Yes," she said. He held her hand, and she held his, and neither of them said anything else for a while, because there wasn't anything else that needed saying. The news moved through the ranch, the way news moves through a small community, not through announcement, but through a kind of collective understanding that assembles itself from details. The way Caleb started eating breakfast at the cookhouse table instead of standing at the prep table. The way Eleanor stopped referring to the main house as Mr. Morgan's house and started saying the house. The way these small shifts registered in the crew's awareness and produced in its wake a particular quality of satisfaction that men have when something is right and they don't need to explain why they know it. Del Pruitt said nothing for 3 days. Then, on a Friday morning, he set a small bundle on the cookhouse step before breakfast, dried herbs from the upper garden tied with twine, the good ones she'd been harvesting. But these were tied differently in a way that took more time. A gift, not a contribution. She picked it up and held it, and understood everything he'd meant to say with it, and couldn't say any other way. Tommy's response was immediate and characteristically Tommy. He grinned for the better part of a day, and when Eleanor told him to stop grinning, he said he would, and then didn't, and she decided she could live with it. Hector, who said the least and understood the most, came to the cookhouse after supper, on the evening she and Caleb had announced simply and without ceremony that they intended to marry in the spring. Hector set 2 eggs on the prep table, his hens the best ones, and said, "For the celebration cake." Then he went back to the bunkhouse. She made the cake the next morning. Honey wild herb, the recipe from Clara's paper, which she'd made her own now through the repetition of making it, and the adjustments that all cooks make without noticing small variations that become their signature. She made it for no occasion other than the fact that there was something to celebrate, and she knew how to celebrate things. The crew ate the entire cake at lunch. Del Pruitt had 2 pieces. Caleb had 3, which he said he didn't, and Eleanor did not argue with because she'd counted. The twist came from a direction nobody had considered, which is the nature of the real ones. Margaret Holt's second letter arrived on a cold Saturday, and Eleanor read it at the prep table, while the morning fire was building, and the ranch was still quiet, and she read it twice, and then she went to find Caleb. He was in the barn. She stood in the door. "Preston Holt is ill," she said. Caleb turned. Margaret wrote, "He's been ill for several weeks. She says it started before the boundary dispute was dropped, which means..." She stopped. "Which means he may have been desperate as well as aggressive," Caleb said very quietly. She nodded. "She says he's asking to see you." The barn was completely silent. She watched his face go through the territory of this, the history of a 4-year fight, the water diversion, the survey marker, the years of pressure, the night. Caleb had sat at the prep table and said I was going to sell. All of that in his face, moving through it, and then settling somewhere she hadn't predicted. "Is he asking for something?" Caleb said. "Margaret says no," Eleanor said. "She says he's asking because he wants to." She paused. "She says he told her that a man shouldn't die having spent 4 years trying to take someone's home from them without at least..." She stopped, read from the letter. "Without at least standing on that man's porch and looking him in the eye." Caleb was quiet for a long time. "What do you think?" he said. She was careful. "I think that some things need to be said out loud before they can be finished," she said. "And I think you get to decide whether that happens here or doesn't happen at all." He looked at the floor of the barn. Then he looked up at her. "If he comes," he said, "will you make coffee?" She felt something in her chest that she didn't have a name for, not quite grief, not quite grace, but something in the family of both. "Yes," she said. "I'll make coffee." He nodded once. He went back to what he'd been doing. She went back to the cookhouse. Preston Holt arrived on a Wednesday 2 weeks later. He came alone, which was the first thing. No rider ahead of him, no lawyer beside him, no Gareth Lyle at a respectful distance. Just a man on a horse on a mountain road, and when he came through the gate, he came slowly, the way sick men move when they're still mobile enough to move under their own authority, but aware that this could change. Howe was thinner than Eleanor had expected from the picture her imagination had built. 60-ish gray throughout, with the look of a man whose considerable force of personality was still present, but had lost some of its anchor in his body. Caleb was in the yard when he arrived. He'd known the day and approximate time because Margaret had written. He stood in the yard, and he looked at the man who had spent 4 years trying to take his ranch, and he said, "Preston." Holt pulled his horse to a stop. He looked at Caleb for a long moment. "Caleb," he said. They stood there for a moment, just that two men who had once been friends and had spent years on opposite sides of something that had cost them both. And Eleanor watched from the cookhouse door with the kind of attention you give to things that are too real and too human to look away from. Then Caleb said, "Come in, there's coffee." Eleanor brought the coffee to the main house, which was the right place for this, not the cookhouse, which was hers, but the house which was the center of what Caleb had built and fought for. She set a pot and 2 cups on the table in the front room, and she went back to the cookhouse without being asked to leave, because she understood that there are conversations that need the room they're in to belong entirely to the people having them. She did not know exactly what was said. She would know later. Some of it Caleb would tell her the parts that mattered in the careful way he told her things, the way he'd learned over the preceding weeks that she was a person worth talking to about the things that were real. What she knew at the time was what she could observe, that they were in that room for an hour and 40 minutes, which was long enough for 2 pots of coffee and something approaching honesty. That when Preston Holt came out onto the porch to leave, he stood for a moment, looking at the yard with the expression of a man taking stock of something he understood differently than he had when he arrived. That he looked at the cookhouse where Eleanor was visible in the window, and he nodded once, and she nodded back, and that was all. That when he rode out through the south gate, Caleb stood on the porch and watched him go, and that after the sound of the horse had faded and the yard was quiet again. Caleb stood there a moment longer, and then he straightened his shoulders in the way he did when he was putting something down and was ready to move forward. He came to the cookhouse. She poured him coffee. He sat down. He wrapped both hands around the cup. He said he was sorry, Caleb said. Eleanor waited. He said he stopped seeing the ranch a long time ago and started seeing only the land, the acreage, the water rights, the numbers. He paused. He said he'd forgotten that there were people on it. "Do you believe him?" Eleanor said. Caleb thought about it the way he thought about things fully without hurrying. "I believe he means it now," he said. "I believe being ill does things to a person's arithmetic." He looked at his coffee. "I don't know if I forgive him. I don't think that's what this was about. I think it was about—" He stopped. "Finishing something," Eleanor said. "Yes," he said. "Finishing it." She sat across from him. "Does it feel finished?" I thought about that too. "Then, mostly," he said. "Close enough." She nodded. He drank his coffee. After a while he said, "Margaret is going to come in October, to see the garden before winter." "I know," Eleanor said. "She wrote me." He looked at her. "You've been corresponding." "For 3 weeks," she said. "She has good questions about the lavender herb salt." Something in his face did the thing it did. Now, the movement from closed to open. The thing she'd come to understand was how he smiled when he meant it. "I'll let you two work it out," he said. "Thank you," she said. October came and the garden gave everything it had left before the frost took it. Eleanor harvested for the better part of 2 weeks, and she had help. She hadn't asked for Del Pruitt and Garrett and Hector and Tommy and Cole Rafferty, who rode over one afternoon with his ranch hand and spent 3 hours helping carry crates without ever presenting it as anything other than being in the neighborhood. She lined the cold storage with enough preserved food to carry the ranch through the worst winter the mountain could produce, and she was proud of it in the way she was proud of things she'd built by hand, which was quietly and without needing anyone to confirm it. Margaret came on the second Saturday of October. She came on horseback alone, the way she'd arrived the first time, and she tied her horse at the post and walked directly to the garden without stopping at the house first, because Eleanor had written her which gate to use. Eleanor was already there, and they picked the last of the herbs together in the thin fall sunlight, working side by side, with the easy efficiency of women who've decided to trust each other. Margaret said at one point, "Preston asked me to give you something." Eleanor looked up. Margaret reached into her coat pocket and produced a small package folded in brown paper and twine. "He said you'd know what it was. He said he found it among the papers from the boundary dispute, the ones his lawyer had pulled." Eleanor took it. She unwrote it carefully. Inside was a piece of paper folded once. She unfolded it. It was a copy of the territorial codicil. The original protection document for the garden, the one from Clara's time, the one that had been filed in 1871 and buried in the records for 15 years. And at the bottom, in a handwriting she didn't recognize, was a line that wasn't in Beaumont's letter. Filed in the name of Clara Jane Morgan, who petitioned this office to protect what she had grown for the sake of those who would grow it after her. Eleanor stood in the garden with the piece of paper in her hands, and she understood all at once what Clara Morgan had done. Not accidentally discovered, not passively protected. Clara had gone to the territorial office herself. Clara had petitioned. Clara had made the case for her garden as something worth preserving, not for herself, but for whoever came after. She'd done it, Margaret's letter implied, in the last autumn of her life. Eleanor folded the paper very carefully. She held it for a moment. "She knew," Eleanor said. "Yes," Margaret said. They worked in silence for a while after that. Not the silence of having nothing to say, but the silence of having said the true thing and letting it breathe. That evening, Eleanor and Caleb sat on the porch again. October porch instead of September porch. Heavier coats the sky, a different shade, the smell of the air, something resinous and clean and final. She showed him the copy of the codicil. He read it. He read the last line twice. He sat with it for a long time. "She never told me," he said. "I know," she said. "She went to Billings. She made the petition. She got this done." He stopped. "She was already sick," he said. "She was sick, and she went to Billings to protect the garden." Eleanor looked at him. "She was taking care of things," she said. "The way she always took care of things." He held the paper. The mountain was dark around them, and the cookhouse light was visible across the yard, warm and steady, the way a fire looks when it's well tended. "I found her recipe," he said. "And then you came, and you used it." He looked at her. "Do you think she planned that?" Eleanor thought about it honestly. "I think she hoped," she said. "People who hide recipes in tin boxes under stones are hoping someone will find them. They're not sure who, but they hope." He was quiet. "She hoped right," Eleanor said. He reached out and took her hand. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat there in the cold October evening, with the codicil and the folded recipe, and the weight of the people who had loved this place before them, and the understanding that love, real love, doesn't end with the people who feel it. It keeps working. It persists in gardens and recipes and documents filed in land offices by women who want to make sure something good survives them. "In the spring," he said. "In the spring," she said. November brought the first real snow, and the ranch took it, the way the ranch took everything, with preparation and steadiness, and the particular competence of people who have done this before and intend to do it again. Eleanor's cookhouse became the center of the ranch in the cold months, in a way it hadn't been in the summer, because cold does, that pulls people toward warmth and light, and the smell of food makes the places where those things exist more important than they already were. The men came in for coffee at all hours. Hector started eating supper there 3 evenings a week, instead of in the bunkhouse. Tommy helped with dishes without being asked, and talked more than was strictly necessary. And she let him, because this too was part of what a kitchen was. She started the lavender herb salt in November, working from Clara's notes and her own adjustments, and the first batch was close. The second batch, 2 weeks later, was right. She knew it immediately when she tasted it, the way you know things that are right, because they aren't trying to be anything other than what they are. She put it in small jars and labeled them in Clara's way, which she'd learned from the jars she'd found in the cold storage that first month, and ingredient nothing extra. She put 6 jars on the cold storage shelf, and 1 on the prep table, and 1 in a package for Margaret Holt in Livingston. Del Pruitt came into the cookhouse one afternoon when she was doing this and looked at the jars on the shelf. "What's that?" he said. "Mountain herb salt," she said. Clara's recipe finished. How was quiet. He picked up one of the jars and turned it in his hands, looking at the label. Then he set it back very carefully with a kind of deliberateness that said something. "Good," he said, and he went back out. Christmas on Morgan Mountain was the first real Christmas the ranch had had in years, and Eleanor knew this because Caleb told her quietly a few days before that after Clara died, he'd stopped marking it. She didn't make it into something large. She made it into something real, which was better. She baked for 3 days, bread and honey cake and apple tart, and something she'd invented specifically for this place, a ginger molasses cake from wild mountain honey, and the last of the preserved summer spices, which came out dense and fragrant, and so precisely right for a cold December mountain that she wrote it down in the back of her grandmother's recipe book as her own. The crew ate together on Christmas evening. All 25 of them, plus Rafferty, who came over with 2 of his hands, plus Margaret Holt, who had made the trip up from Livingston on the grounds that she had nowhere better to be and intended to make a habit of this. Caleb sat at the head of the table, and Eleanor sat at the other end, and the table stretched between them full of men and food, and the kind of noise that happens when people feel safe enough to be loud. Del Pruitt made a toast. This was not expected. Del was not a toast-making man, and everyone knew it, and the table went quiet. In the startled way, tables go quiet when something unprecedented is happening. He stood up with his coffee cup, because there was no whiskey, and he held it level, and he said, looking at Eleanor, "To the woman who came up this mountain when nobody wanted her here and made it somewhere worth being." The table lifted their cups. Eleanor looked at Del Pruitt and she said, "Sit down, Del," because she didn't trust her voice for anything more than that. And he sat down with the satisfied expression of a man who has said the right thing, and the table went back to being loud. Caleb looked at her from the other end of the table, and the look he gave her said everything he hadn't said out loud, which was considerable, and she held it for a moment before she looked down at her plate, because some things were too full to look at directly. The spring came late, the way spring always came late, to high country, reluctantly with setbacks, with days that felt like March pretending to be May, before eventually conceding to the real thing. She was in the garden on the first true warm morning, her hands in the soil, feeling the temperature of it, assessing what had survived the winter and what needed to start fresh, when she heard Caleb's boots on the path above her. She didn't look up right away. She let him come to where she was. He crouched beside her. She looked at him. "The peaches are budding," he said. She turned and looked. The 6 peach trees on the upper slope which had given her the pies that first impossible night, which Clara had planted the spring after she came up the mountain, because she wasn't going to live somewhere without peaches in the summer, they were budding. Small, tight, promising. "August," Eleanor said. "August," he said. They looked at the trees for a moment. Then he said, "The circuit preacher comes through in May." She turned and looked at him. "We could wait until August," he said. "I could build us a case for waiting until August. The weather's better. The cattle have been moved to summer pasture. There's less pressure on the—" "Caleb," she said. He stopped. "May," she said. He looked at her. "May." "May," she said again. "Don't build cases. Come to the point." He looked at her for a moment, and then he did the thing he'd been doing since October. He smiled, the real one, the one that changed his face entirely, and he said, "May." She turned back to the garden. She pressed her hands flat against the soil, feeling the warmth in it, the particular warmth of mountain earth, coming back to life after a long, cold season, the warmth of something that had endured and was ready to produce again. She thought about Springfield and the fire and the canvas bag and the recipe book she'd grabbed off the wall. She thought about the supply wagon and the dust and the 40 men who walked away from her first supper and the night she'd lit the fire at midnight and made 6 peach pies from the trees of a woman she'd never met. She thought about Del Pruitt with his hat in his hands and Tommy with his mother's letter, and Hector with his 2 eggs. She thought about Harper saying the best meal I've had in 20 years, and Donovan saying, I understand what you put on that table. She thought about Margaret Holt with her hand on a peach tree branch. She thought about Clara's recipe under the stone and the codicil in the land office, and the handwriting that said, for the sake of those who would grow it after her. She thought about a man who had kept the land without knowing how to keep what the land was for until someone came and reminded him. She pulled a handful of cold earth in her palm and held it and felt it warm in her hand, and she thought, this is what belonging feels like. This is what it is to be in the right place. She set the earth down gently. In May, she said, I'm going to make the honey cake for the wedding table. Is that an announcement? He said. It's a plan, she said. I make those. He stood up. He offered her his hand and she took it and stood. The morning was all around them, the mountain and the garden and the peach trees with their tight new buds, and the cookhouse with the fire she'd banked and would relight, and the main house, and the barn, and the corrals, and 25 men who had come up a mountain and found a reason to stay. Caleb Morgan held Eleanor Hayes' hand in the garden his wife had built, and the woman he loved had restored, and he looked at her with the look that was only hers, the real one, the open one, and he said very simply, thank you. She held his gaze. For what? For going back to the kitchen, he said. That first night, when they walked out. For going back. She thought about that night. The 40 untouched plates. The cold food. The quiet promise she'd made to herself in an empty cookhouse. I almost didn't, she said. I know, he said. That's why I'm thanking you. She squeezed his hand once. Then she turned toward the cookhouse, because the fire needed relighting, and breakfast needed making, and the ranch needed feeding, and it was a new morning on Morgan Mountain, and there was work to do, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She walked through the garden she had brought back from the edge of being lost, past the peach trees that would fruit in August, past the herb beds that carried a dead woman's knowledge forward into living hands, past the raspberry canes that would give again in summer, and the apple trees on the west fence, and the lavender herb salt aging on the cookhouse shelf. And she felt all of it around her, like the thing. It was not just a garden, not just a ranch, not just a job she'd taken in desperation from a wagon headed north. A life, a real one. Built from kindness and stubbornness and 6 peach pies made at midnight by a woman who refused to leave. She pushed open the cookhouse door. She lit the fire. She started cooking. And Morgan Mountain Ranch, which had been a place where a man survived alone, became something that no land and no money and no boundary dispute could ever take from either of them. A home finally and fully, and without condition,